Hey guys, tonight we journey through a story of salt, secrets, and sleepy footsteps across the grand roads of 18th century France. But don't worry, it's not as intense as it sounds. Though, if you were a French peasant back then, you probably wouldn't survive this particular royal headache. Salt might seem ordinary, but in those days, it was the difference between preserving your food or going hungry, following the law or risking punishment, and ultimately, it shaped a kingdom's fate. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to share where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself under a fading sunset, walking along an old dirt road in the French countryside. A soft breeze ruffles your clothes, carrying the last hint of summer warmth as it brushes your cheeks. In the distance, the silhouettes of rustic cottages stand guard, little wisps of chimney smoke beckoning you toward a snug gathering place. You can almost taste the tang of well-seasoned soup in the air. Salt, it's there in every meal, crucial to flavor and preservation. Think about how you open your cupboard today. There's always that well-sealed container of it, right? Now imagine living in a world where such a simple staple becomes a symbol of wealth, power, and, ironically, oppression. It's the 18th century, and the French monarchy is looking for ways to fill its coffers to support a lavish court culture. Regular banquets, fancy dresses, and wild parties that would make even the most fearless nightclub bouncer raise an eyebrow. One of the monarchy's big ideas, a special tax on salt, known as the Gabelle. As you trudge across the uneven ground, you can't help but notice how ordinary villagers whisper about this dreaded levy, how it's not just an expense but an ever-present storm cloud looming in the sky. Salt has always mattered. Throughout human history, it's allowed people to preserve fish, meats, and vegetables long before refrigerators existed. It's also an important way for the body to stay balanced, so failing to get enough salt can actually make you ill. But it's not exactly a thrilling conversation starter at dinner parties. "Hey, pass the salt," is about as common as "can you believe the weather?" Then again, here in old France, that's precisely where the story gets interesting. Once the monarchy realizes how lucrative a salt tax might be, the Gabelle begins to cast its long, tedious shadow over daily life. If you think waiting in line at a modern DMV is a lesson in patience, try braving the confusion of state salt depots back then. Truly a test of endurance. Historians still argue whether the monarchy genuinely grasped how widespread the resentment would grow, or if they were blinded by their own shimmering crystal chandeliers. On one hand, the monarchy needs money to keep up appearances. France is a major European power, after all, and lavish spectacles are a way to show off. But no one asked the peasants if they enjoyed paying extra for something as fundamental as salt. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Picture yourself living in a small village, raising chickens and goats, growing wheat or barley, and struggling to feed your family through harsh winters. Suddenly, the king's officials impose complicated new rules on how much salt you must buy and from whom. And if you're caught with unregulated salt, trouble awaits. One quirky rumor claims that rural folks started hiding their salt in hollowed-out loaves of bread or secret compartments in wagon wheels, smuggling not for the thrill of it, but just to keep their cupboards stocked. Whether or not every rumor is true, you sense the paranoia creeping into daily life. With dusk settling over your path, you step around a puddle left over from yesterday's rain. A distant donkey brays, and someone curses under their breath. There's your first taste of comedic relief in a land weighed down by salt taxes. You can't help but grin at how something so mundane can spark such frustration. Then again, you remind yourself, if your next meal depends on a pinch of salt, frustration quickly turns serious. A local farmer might crack a joke about putting your salt in your sock, so the taxman never finds it. But behind that nervous laughter is a genuine sense of injustice. A mainstream historical fact you can't ignore: by the mid-1700s, the Gabelle was so despised that people risked harsh penalties rather than comply with official rates. It wasn't just that the tax existed, but that it was enforced in an extremely uneven way depending on where you lived. Some provinces had a lower salt tax, while others found it crippling. Imagine hearing that your cousin in a different region pays a fraction of the rate you do. There goes your sense of fairness. This disparity sowed seeds of anger and gave rise to frequent calls for reform. Of course, reforms came at a snail's pace, if at all. By now, the sky is nearly dark, stars fading in behind a thin veil of clouds. The gentle hush that signals bedtime in your own world parallels the hush of peasants in the old days, forced to keep quiet about their salt stash. One joke that might pop into your head: sure, we can't bring down the monarchy, but maybe we can spice up our dinner without them finding out. That's 18th century rebellious humor in a nutshell. Beneath that joke lies the stark reality: break the law, and you risk fines, jail, or worse. More than one unlucky soul found themselves carted away, all for a few grains of illicit salt. As you continue down this imagined lane, you see the silhouette of a roadside tavern. Lights flicker through the windows, and laughter wafts out. But the moment you cross the threshold, conversations hush. People here talk about the Gabelle in low voices, wary of informants or the dreaded tax collectors who might be lurking just beyond the wooden shutters. You feel their tension, like a tight wire about to snap. No one wants to be the next example of the crown's authority. The monarchy, for its part, lumbers forward, trying to hold on to a system that guarantees them revenue, as if that alone can keep their elaborate lifestyle afloat. Yet you sense something brewing beneath the surface, a quiet discontent that the monarchy might be too caught up in its own pomp to notice. You rest at a worn table, the planks beneath your fingertips polished by time and many anxious hands. As your eyelids grow heavy, think of salt's looming shadow. It follows you in every meal, every whisper of complaint, and every plan formed around smuggling. No one escapes its presence, from the lowliest servant to the richest noble. And as you sink deeper into this warm, drowsy air, you realize that this simple mineral is more than just a flavor enhancer. Here in 18th century France, it might just be the spark that ignites a sweeping transformation. You remain seated at that worn tavern table, the low lantern light gently flickering across the faces of villagers who've gathered. The hum of hushed conversation fills your ears, but even within this subdued chatter, there's a palpable tension whenever someone mentions salt. An old man at the bar recounts how, in earlier days, folks could acquire salt without too much trouble, just a routine trade along the rivers or with merchants in bustling town markets. But then the crown stepped in, deciding it was time to reshape the rules and, of course, to collect more money in the process. You listen, your elbows resting on the table, as he explains how the Gabelle took shape, not a sudden bolt from the blue, but a set of laws refined and expanded over time, like an ever-tightening noose around the peasants' necks. He leans in, voice lowered, and tells you that in some places, the monarchy insisted households buy a minimum amount of salt from official depots, even if they didn't really need it. To disobey was unthinkable, heavily fined, or worse. You can imagine the frustration of a poor family forced to purchase more salt than they could ever use. If you'd been around back then, you might have wondered if the crown was going to start taxing something else just as essential, like water or even the air you breathe. Knowing 18th century France, that might not have been too far fetched. You stifle a grin at the thought of peasants carrying satchels of precious, approved air on their backs, but in this climate, the idea seems only half a joke. The Gabelle wasn't an overnight invention. Technically, the seeds for salt taxation go back centuries, with earlier monarchs dabbling in ways to control and profit from this precious mineral. But by the time the 18th century rolls around, the Gabelle has solidified into a monstrous and complicated system, prone to corruption and outright extortion. Your tavern companion waves a hand, as if brushing away a bad memory, mentioning that the monarchy used the revenue to cover mounting debts from wars, to finance fortress repairs, and, lest we forget, to fund those sparkly Versailles soirees. More than one witty onlooker has joked that you could probably taste the salt in the chandeliers if you licked them, given how the crown had seemingly poured these taxes into every crystal droplet. Though you decide not to dwell on the image of folks at a palace ball, tongues out, testing decorative ornaments. Some jokes should remain in the imagination. This is where the Gabelle earned its infamous reputation. It aimed to fill the royal treasury, but it often left the poorest subjects worse off than ever. A mainstream historical fact that stands out is that by the mid-1700s, over half of the crown's revenue from indirect taxes came specifically from the Gabelle. The monarchy was hooked, so to speak, on that steady stream of salt money, which spelled near certain doom for those trying to skirt the law. There were different categories and rates of the Gabelle, depending on the province or region in France. So while you might pay one rate in Brittany, your cousin in another province might be charged something entirely different, stirring envy, confusion, and anger among those forced into the higher brackets. That's how, quite rapidly, the Gabelle became emblematic of everything unfair about the old regime. You toy with a cup of watered-down wine, listening to the tavern's swirl of voices. Nearby, a young woman with smudges of flour on her apron complains how her family never used to think twice about tossing a pinch of salt into their bread dough. Now, they calculate every grain with the precision of a jeweler weighing gold. You can practically feel the tension in her shoulders as she gestures, describing how neighbors find themselves at the mercy of petty tax agents. One of the locals, eyebrows arched, chimes in with a sly grin. At least the tax collectors can't measure how much salt we cry into our soup. It's a bleak kind of humor, but in times like these, you cling to any comedic relief you can muster. As the evening deepens, you soak in more details of how this entire system came crashing into small-town life. Royal officials, decked in finery, would announce the rates for the coming season. People grumbled, but they had no real choice. Salt was necessary for curing fish and meat. If you didn't have it, your food would spoil. And while a wealthy merchant in Paris might shrug off the extra cost, a family living on meager farmland might see their annual budget thrown into disarray. The system even gave rise to special salt warehouses with official guards, turning a once simple product into a coveted and heavily policed commodity. One quirky tale you overhear is about a village priest who reportedly tried to bless an entire salt depot, praying it would vanish so that the locals could be spared the burden. Whether this attempt actually happened, or if it's just folklore, it highlights how desperate some communities were for a miracle. Around your table, someone mentions that historians still argue whether the monarchy genuinely believed the salt tax could be administered fairly, or if it was a calculated gamble that sacrificed peasants' well, being for the sake of sustaining royal grandeur. At the heart of it, no one can seem to agree on whether the crown was naïve or knowingly oppressive. Regardless, the outcome was the same widespread resentment. A man with a fiddle slung over his shoulder drifts closer, glancing at you. He talks about how, despite the gloom, a few wandering minstrels made an entire repertoire of comedic songs about the salted king and the pinch purse monarch. Although these tunes never made it into the official record books, they circulated around rural fairs, tavern gatherings, and wherever folks were brave enough to risk singing them. He claims to know a couple of those songs, but given the local tax inspector might be eavesdropping, he offers only a sly wink in place of a performance. Another joke that arises in conversation is how the monarchy might eventually resort to measuring the salt content of the tears you shed if you dare cry in protest. It's just an offhand quip, but you sense the real bitterness behind it. Eventually, talk shifts to the infamous punishments. Get caught with contraband salt bought or traded under the table, and you could face hefty fines or imprisonment. Officials hired informants, people in the community who might keep their eyes and ears open for any suspicious dealings. It bred a culture of mistrust. One never knew if the friendly neighbor might be moonlighting as a snitch for the crown, eager to collect a reward. The tavern keeper, wiping down the counter, tells you that no matter how hard they tried, peasants simply couldn't avoid the watchful gaze of the Gabelle system. The monarchy even deployed armed patrols in certain regions to crack down on smugglers. And smugglers, of course, did exist. Where there is a heavy tax, there is always someone willing to bend the rules. But those people take a huge risk. You picture them traveling by moonlight, carefully transporting small sacks of salt hidden in carts, donkey saddlebags, or even stitched inside the linings of coats. It's no wonder the monarchy felt threatened. Salt smuggling turned out to be an unintended consequence of greed. Your eyes grow wary as the night lengthens, the chatter around you fading into a comforting, low-pitched lull. You realize that the Gabelle shaped not just the economy, but the social fabric of France, sowing mistrust, breeding resentment, and, ultimately, fanning the flames of change. Everyone in this smoky tavern shares a common burden. Families, farmers, bakers, tradesmen, all living under the watchful eye of a salt tax that has become larger than life. And for now, you let your gaze fall on the single candle stub near your elbow, the warm glow dancing in a slow, mesmerizing waltz. With each flicker, you sense the tension in the room, wondering if anyone can truly remain untouched by the weight of the Gabelle. You rise from the tavern bench with stiff legs, still warmed by the low lamp's glow and the friendly nods of villagers. The next morning finds you tracing a narrow path away from the sleepy hamlet, where the horizon stretches out under a pale sun. As you walk, your mind drifts to the stories you heard last night. The jokes, the fears, and the frustration over Salt's stranglehold on everyday life. A light breeze rustles through fields dotted with daisies, a tranquil backdrop that seems miles away from the grandeur of the royal courts. Yet you know that somewhere beyond those rolling hills stands the opulence of Versailles and other lavish estates, funded in part by taxes like the Gabelle. If salt is the unsung character in this national drama, the monarchy is undoubtedly the star, lit by chandeliers and clinking glasses. Imagine yourself nearing the outskirts of a bustling city, where cobblestone streets vibrate with carriage wheels, fancy footmen in embroidered livery, and curious onlookers hoping to glimpse a duke or a countess. The air smells different here, a little bit of horse, a little bit of baking bread, and somewhere in the mix, a hint of expensive perfume trailing from a passing carriage window. You slip through the crowds, drawn toward the distant silhouette of a palace. This is where the monarchy entertains foreign dignitaries and dazzles visiting nobility from sun up to sundown. On any given evening, you might find a lavish banquet celebrating some minor diplomatic triumph. An excuse for more courses than you can count, each dish prepared with a generous dash of salt, of course, because no one's worried about how much it costs here. You've heard that in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, sunlight pours through tall windows and dances off hundreds of reflective panels, creating a spectacle bright enough to rival the modern-day paparazzi's camera flashes. It's said that no expense was spared in adorning those corridors with gilt carvings, marble busts, and paintings depicting heroic battles or mythical scenes. A mainstream historical fact, you might recall the palace complex wasn't merely for show. Under Louis XIV's influence, it became a seat of power designed to keep the nobility physically close to the king, effectively taming potential rivals by enveloping them in a swirl of constant festivities. But as you step deeper into this mental picture, you see that behind every shimmering facade lurks the hidden suffering of a population stretched thin by taxes. If you were to walk among the courtiers in their splendid finery, you might hear a snippet or two of conversation about the salt tax. Yes, dreadful business. Someone says, adjusting a jeweled brooch. But so necessary for the health of the realm, chimes in another, who likely never had to skip a meal in his life. Meanwhile, a pair of well-dressed ladies might gossip about the latest rumor that some minor baron was caught with contraband salt, shocking the court. The ladies feign outrage in a tone that suggests they're mildly amused, perhaps imagining how contraband salt might be smuggled in a powdered wig. There's an absurd idea for the next masquerade. You smirk at the mental image, but remember that for peasants, the risk is no laughing matter. Quirky tidbits float through the gilded halls, half-truths and rumors about what the monarchy does behind closed doors, wild card games, exotic pets roaming private menageries, or extravagant fireworks that outshine the starry sky. You might even hear a rumor that some courtiers use a pinch of gold leaf on certain dishes, just for show. Since they already control salt, why not put some sparkle on top of that roasted pheasant? It's the kind of detail that probably sounds too outrageous to be true. Then again, these are people who once turned dancing into a political statement. Amid this glitter, the monarchy's sweet talk about prosperity for all fades quickly. You recall that historians still argue whether the French crown truly believed such extravagant displays strengthened the nation's prestige, or if the royals were simply drunk on their own luxury, oblivious to the rumblings of discontent beyond palace walls. Perhaps they thought the salt tax was a necessary evil, a modest sacrifice from the provinces to bolster France's standing on the world stage. After all, if you're dancing in gold-threaded slippers, how pressing can the peasants' salt complaints be? Yet for every jubilant party, there's a hidden world of quiet suffering. If you slip out of the palace grounds and wander to the less splendid quarters of the city, cramped alleyways, dilapidated homes, and smoky little shops, you'll see the real impact of salt restrictions. A tired baker might be stretching his flour supply, carefully measuring the salt he can afford to purchase legally. A fishmonger tries to preserve her catch, cursing the mandatory fees that eat into any chance of profit. Down the street, children scrounge for scraps, and their mothers wonder why the monarchy can't levy a less burdensome tax, instead of hoarding wealth in mirrored halls. Someone jokes that if the monarchy were forced to pay the Gabelle itself, it might think twice about all those opulent buffets. You can't help but grin at the image of powdered wigs fumbling for spare coins just to season their soup. But jokes aside, you sense the tension that travels from the dustiest stable boy to the highest echelons of the court. While it may not be spoken loudly in Versailles, people know that the salt tax is creating a simmering unrest. One false step by the monarchy could fan these small embers into a larger flame. You pass by a row of gaunt faces leaning out windows, capturing the gap between the spectacle of wealth and the stark reality of daily hunger. The monarchy might toast to prosperity with crystal goblets, but the emptiness in these neighborhoods is impossible to ignore. You slip once more through the ornate palace gates in your imagination, just in time to overhear a snippet of a grand dinner plan. You imagine a steward announcing the evening's courses: roasted game birds, glistening vegetables, sauces salted to perfection. This parade of dishes not only dazzles the senses, but also demonstrates the monarchy's wealth. The courtiers lean in, praising the flavors, though for you, each bite is laced with the bitter knowledge of peasants forced to buy their share of salt from the crown's warehouses. The irony is as thick as the gravy on the table. In corners of the palace, a few forward-thinking aristocrats murmur that the old ways might not hold forever. They warn that oppression can only go so far before the tide turns. It's an unpopular opinion among those whose family fortunes rest on maintaining the status quo. Still, the whispers persist, scattered among the laughter and violin music. Sometimes the most provocative truths are exchanged in hushed tones behind velvet curtains. You can't blame them. You wouldn't want to voice dissent openly either, not if you value your position at court. Nor if you value your head, for that matter. Dusk settles across the palace gardens, bathing the statues and manicured lawns in a soft glow. You watch from the shadows as lanterns begin to flicker, illuminating the gilded terraces where courtiers gather to gossip, flirt, and preen. Despite the gentle hush of twilight, you sense an almost electric undercurrent, a tension that has no official name, but is felt in the hearts of those who pay attention. The monarchy prances about in a dream of its own making, while outside these walls, men and women lose sleep over how they'll afford next week's salt. You stifle a soft laugh, imagining that if they tried to replicate the palace's extravagance in the countryside, they'd have to rename it Sleepless, in tribute to the Gabelle. It's a corny pun, but at this point, a bit of silliness might be exactly what's needed to offset the gloom. By the time the final carriage wheels roll away, and the palace interior dims to candlelit corridors, you decide you've had enough of this display. Your eyes grow heavy from the swirling color and shimmer. Outside, in the crisp air, you reflect on the stark disconnect between these two worlds, the shimmering illusions of the court and the heavy, unavoidable grind of tax-laden existence that weighs on the majority of France. The monarchy may boast of its conquests, its culture, and its style, but the question remains, how long can such radiance last, when at its root lies an unrelenting burden on those who can least afford it? You slip away from the dazzling corridors of power, drawn toward dimly lit backroads and hushed whispers that beckon in the night. When dusk settles and the watchful eyes of tax collectors soften behind shuttered windows, the world of salt smuggling awakens. You can practically feel the tension in the air, the faint clink of wagon wheels on gravel, the subtle rustle of a burlap sack being hoisted onto a donkey's back, or the soft whistle signaling it's safe to proceed. It's a clandestine dance that unfolds away from the palace glow, and you find yourself stepping cautiously, ears tuned for the snap of a twig that might betray your presence. All around, silhouettes drift beneath the moonlight. Hardy peasants, crafty traders, and more than a few desperate souls willing to gamble their freedom just to skirt the crushing expense of the Gabelle. You catch a low conversation, someone whispering about a new route through the forest, or the best time to cross a certain bridge without encountering the king's patrol. It's more than just an adrenaline rush. For many, smuggling is a matter of survival. After all, who can tolerate paying a fortune for something as basic as salt, when one stroke of cunning can dodge the monarchy's heavy hand? In a shady clearing, a makeshift meeting point emerges. Men and women congregate, stifling yawns and adjusting their cloaks. You notice their shoulders carry not only the literal weight of salted sacks, but also the emotional burden of risking arrest. Laughter bubbles up quietly when someone cracks a joke about seasoning your pillow being the only way to guarantee sweet dreams these days. It's the sort of joke that might seem silly if you weren't standing in the middle of a forest, jittery about the next set of footsteps that could appear out of the dark. Someone else snickers that the monarchy should tax the stars if they want more money. At least starlight can't be smuggled. The humor is grim but oddly necessary, a pressure valve for the tension that hangs over every secret gathering. The smugglers' routes wind through valleys and wooded groves, often following the same hidden paths used for other types of contraband over the centuries. A mainstream historical fact in the 18th century, clandestine networks stretched across much of France, particularly in the south and the west, where the geography allowed for easier concealment. Smugglers typically moved under cover of night, planning their journeys when official checkpoints were less guarded, or the watchman too sleepy to raise an alarm. Some even disguise their salt shipments as common goods, grain, flour, or barrels of vinegar, anything to deflect suspicion during a casual inspection. But it's not just the threat of watchful soldiers that sets nerves on edge. A significant fear among smugglers is betrayal from within their ranks. If the monarchy was willing to offer rewards for tipping off illegal activity, the temptation to turn in a neighbor could be strong. This environment of distrust explains why smugglers rely on hush signals, and layered secrecy. One quirky tidbit you hear whispered among them: certain groups developed coded phrases like, "Tonight, the moon tastes bitter," meaning the route ahead was dangerous or compromised. It's the sort of cloak and dagger flourish that sounds ripped from a spy novel, except here, it's about preserving a precious mineral rather than toppling governments. Though you might argue that messing with salt is a quiet way of undermining the king's authority. You try to imagine how these nighttime escapades look to an outsider. A line of mules trudges along a seldom used road, sacks slung across their flanks, each step kicking up a faint cloud of dust in the moonlight. You might see a silhouette perched on a low branch, scanning the horizon for any flicker of lanterns that could signal approaching patrols. Silent hand gestures ripple through the group, and they halt at the first sign of trouble, hearts pounding. Then a wave from the lookout signals all clear, and the procession continues. It's a far cry from the gilded spectacle of Versailles, yet in its own tense way, it's just as choreographed. Historians still argue whether the monarchy, at times, allowed certain regions to slip under the radar, because trying to police every corner of the kingdom was too costly. Perhaps officials understood that smugglers would continue their trade, no matter how harsh the penalties. It wouldn't be surprising if some tax collectors occasionally turned a blind eye for a little extra coin in their own pockets. Corruption, after all, isn't exactly an invention of the modern era. Even in the 18th century, the concept of "look the other way and we'll make it worth your while" could keep certain backcountry routes suspiciously open for business. While smuggling is often painted as a grand adventure, there's real danger involved. One stray shout or flicker of torchlight can ruin everything. The penalties for being caught with illegal salt are severe: heavy fines, imprisonment, forced labor. You overhear someone recounting how a neighbor's cousin ended up in a damp jail cell, all for a single miscounted sack. The story has an ominous ring. The walls were said to be so wet that a man could practically lick the stone and taste the mineral deposits forming along the cracks. "At least you'd never run out of salt," he jokes bleakly. The group offers strained smiles, but the moral of that tale is crystal clear: be vigilant or pay dearly. You find a moment to speak with a smuggler who's leaning against a tree trunk, arms crossed. Dark circles beneath his eyes suggest he's seen many sleepless nights. He confesses that half the reason he's involved is to feed his family. He simply can't afford the official salt. Another part, though, is the rebellious thrill of outsmarting a system he believes is unfair. He raises an eyebrow and notes with wry humor, "If the king wants to keep all the salt to himself, maybe he should come down here and carry these sacks." You can't help but chuckle, picturing a royal figure stumbling through muddy paths in buckled shoes. It's an image that belongs on a stage play poster, complete with comedic fanfare. Still, the gravity of their situation lingers. The monarchy won't take kindly to losing revenue, especially not revenue so critical to its lavish lifestyles and war debts. Over time, you've heard, patrols have become more aggressive, seizing any suspicious wagons and searching huts along known smuggling routes. And the smugglers in turn adapt. Their knowledge of remote trails is as deep as their desire to bypass the Gabelle. Some incorporate early warning systems, children posted at vantage points, whistles passed from farm to farm. Others create decoy convoys to distract guards, while the real shipment takes a safer route. If it sounds like a strategy from a modern heist film, that's probably because these folks are as inventive as any band of rogues with limited resources and a lot to lose. Amid the tension, you feel a sense of camaraderie binding these smugglers together. They share a hushed gratitude when a shipment passes successfully, the moment they arrive at a designated safe house, a barn on the outskirts of a village, or a cellar beneath a crumbling estate. They exhale relief like a spring finally uncoiling. There might even be a fleeting celebration, a small toast of watered-down wine, a communal meal spiced with the contraband salt itself, a daring little act of defiance. The local farmers who benefit from these shipments show their thanks in small ways, a place to hide if patrols come near, or fresh horses to carry on the journey. It's a mutual aid network that thrives in the dark corners of the kingdom. Eventually, as the moon dips lower, the group disperses, each smuggler returning to their home or secret hideout. You continue alone, the night breeze chilling your cheeks, every snap of a twig making you flinch. Yet there's a strange sense of awe in the air. You've just witnessed a covert world that demonstrates how deeply people value this seemingly simple mineral, and the lengths they'll go to preserve access to it. And as you tread carefully along a narrow path, you can't help but marvel at the resilience and resourcefulness ignited by something as ordinary as salt. You step out from the secretive world of smugglers and into the echoing corridors of a grand aristocratic estate, gilded doorways, marble floors, and the smell of fresh, cut flowers arranged in tall vases. It's the sort of place you'd expect to be free of any care, but deciding what silks to wear to the next ball. Yet beneath these polished surfaces, there's a quiet storm brewing. You notice the hush of well-dressed figures leaning in too close, their hushed tones hinting at conflict the monarchy would rather keep under wraps. These are the noble elites, proud possessors of land and lineage, but increasingly uneasy about the future. After all, a kingdom weighed down by an unpopular salt tax isn't exactly an ideal setting for stable governance, no matter how shiny the chandeliers. As you amble down a corridor lined with portraits, men in powdered wigs, women with elaborate coiffures, you can almost hear their whispers of discontent. All that revenue wasted on yet another palace renovation, says a passing marquis, voice dripping with sarcasm. Do they think we can keep up appearances if the peasants are outright refusing to pay any more? Wonders another. You catch snatches of these conversations like fragments of a half-remembered dream. Some among the nobility chafe at the monarchy's extravagance because, ironically, they're expected to follow suit, hosting lavish gatherings of their own to maintain status. And what if their lands or peasants can't meet the growing demands of taxes, salt or otherwise? There's an unspoken pressure here to appear unruffled, yet you detect the faint tremor beneath the surface. In a side chamber, an anxious countess paces across the mosaic floor, her slippers tapping out a rapid staccato. A boisterous baron tries to reassure her that the monarchy will handle things, maybe lower the salt tax or offer some type of financial relief to landowners. The countess only laughs, a delicate but joyless sound, as though she's imagining exactly how many times the monarchy has promised to fix something, only to put it off for another round of courtiers' banquets. You can't help but think of a modern joke. That's like trusting your goldfish to guard the cat's dinner. Clearly, the monarchy is not exactly rushing to fix the system it benefits from. What's remarkable is that these same aristocrats also enjoy privileges that peasants can only dream of. Less direct taxation, inherited titles, property rights, and political connections. So you might wonder, why are they complaining at all? One mainstream historical fact is that a number of nobles had fallen on hard times financially, and while they had social status and fancy ancestral homes, some were effectively land-rich but cash-poor. Maintaining a chateau, staff, and all the trappings of nobility can be just as draining as that daily slog you see in villages, albeit from a very different perspective. If you spend your evenings throwing expensive soirees, eventually the bills come due. Salt taxes might feel like a pebble in the shoe compared to the enormous budgets these folks juggle, but that pebble still hurts. A footman in a gold-buttoned vest glides by, carrying a tray of delicate pastries, each topped with a sugared rose petal. You wonder what the peasants would think if they saw such luxury. Probably the same reaction you have right now. Where does all this money come from? And is this really the best use of it? Still, you can't deny the pastries look divine. You catch a snippet of hushed gossip. They say the king's personal chef tastes every dish at least twice. I'd be more worried about tasting the protests boiling outside these walls. You half expect the footman to roll his eyes, but he moves on in stoic silence. And so it goes. The monarchy sparkles at the center of the realm, and the nobility, once a powerful check against royal excess, finds itself torn. On the one hand, many owe their positions directly to the crown's favor. On the other, they feel the tremors of an overtaxed, restless society. Some fear losing their own wealth, or perhaps more frightening, losing the social order that props up their privilege. Historians still argue whether the nobles genuinely feared a full-scale uprising or simply wished for moderate reforms that would quell the peasants without dismantling the aristocratic hierarchy. In either case, the tension is palpable. Wandering through a lush parlor, you spot a conversation circle of refined ladies fanning themselves. When the subject of the Gabelle arises, they exchange polite grimaces, as though speaking of something distasteful. One discreetly mentions that her estate managers have warned her about rising discontent in the local village, where rumors say peasants are considering outright refusal to pay. Another lady confides, in a hushed voice, that her own finances are stretched thin. The unsaid question hovers in the perfumed air: if peasants refuse to pay, who will finance the opulence that they themselves, the nobility, must keep up for the sake of tradition? It's not all gloom and doom, though. Some nobles find comedic outlets for their frustrations, perhaps commissioning a sly painting that depicts a royal figure with a donkey's head hidden among the cherubs and allegorical scenes so that only the sharp-eyed observer catches the joke. One quirky tidbit floating around is that a certain duke supposedly had his portrait painted with a giant salt shaker in the background, a quiet protest disguised as a whimsical prop. Whether this actually happened or it's just a bit of satirical gossip, it reflects how the Gabelle had become an unseemly stain on everyone's thoughts. Late in the evening, a small gathering forms in a low-lit salon. You can imagine the aromatic smoke of a fine pipe swirling among well-dressed conspirators. They speak candidly, each voice carefully pitched so as not to carry through the walls. They argue that the monarchy's blind pursuit of taxes is endangering the entire nation. Yet few are bold enough to propose a direct challenge. Fear is like a phantom servant in the corner, always present, always listening. One wisecrack emerges from the tension. If we can't talk sense into the king, maybe we should write him a letter in invisible ink, mixed with contraband salt. You can't help but stifle a chuckle at the image of the king squinting at a blank sheet of parchment, unaware that salty secret words lurk there. Still, there's no denying that at least a few aristocrats are quietly storing up their frustrations. Some wonder if the monarchy's love affair with taxes will ever subside. Others begin to wonder if they should side with the rising calls for reform, at least enough to keep themselves in good standing with the people they rule. It's a precarious dance to support the monarchy too blatantly, and you might be swept up when the peasants revolt, oppose it too loudly, and the monarchy could banish you from court, or worse. That's a lot of stress for a group known for powdering their wigs and drinking chocolate in the mornings. Outside, the skies darken, and a late night stillness envelops the estate. You hear the echo of footsteps in distant halls, perhaps a servant drawing the curtains or a restless noble pacing, unable to sleep. The corridor you stand in looks endless, lined with tapestries depicting scenes from ancient mythology. Dimly lit by ornate wall sconces, the faces in the tapestries seem to watch you with silent intrigue. You feel a flicker of empathy for these aristocrats, caught in the crosshairs of royal policy and simmering public unrest. They live in a world where every public display must be immaculate, but behind the scenes, worry seeps in like an invisible draft. By now, your eyelids grow heavy. That polished marble floor and those velvet seats look more inviting than they did hours earlier. You sense the hush that descends after midnight, when whispered grievances slip behind the veneer of polite conversation. As you drift onward, the question lingers: how will these nobles act when push comes to shove? Will they rally behind the crown and its dreaded salt tax, or find a way to stand up, if not for justice, then at least to protect their own future? The answer is far from simple, and the silence in these gilded corridors is more telling than any official decree. From the hushed corridors of aristocratic worry, you drift into the domain where legal authority flexes its muscles. Courts and tribunals intent on preserving the Gabelle's grip. You can almost hear the stiff shuffle of robes brushing against stone floors, the echo of a judge's gavel like thunder rolling through a vaulted chamber. These are spaces of solemnity and routine, yet they radiate an undercurrent of tension. Everyone knows the monarchy's stance on contraband salt's zero tolerance, or at least that's the official line. But as you soon discover, enforcing that line proves far more complicated. Picture yourself stepping into a grand courtroom, its tall windows draped with heavy burgundy curtains. A scattering of onlookers occupies wooden benches, expressions ranging from anxious to jaded. At the front stands a magistrate in a powdered wig, looking as though he stepped straight out of a caricature. But his gaze is as sharp as a falcon's. A hush settles in the chamber, punctuated by the rustle of parchment as scribes prepare to transcribe every word. Here, individuals accused of salt smuggling or failing to pay the required share of the tax stand trial. Some appear stoic, arms crossed in resignation. Others look visibly rattled, knuckles whitening as they grip the dock's rail. The charges often hinge on minor details. Was a villager found with more salt than his official ration? Did he purchase it from an unapproved seller? Was there evidence of nighttime rendezvous with known smugglers, or secret compartments built into a wagon floor? The monarchy, desperate to make examples, invests considerable resources into investigating these infractions. A mainstream historical fact emerges: specialized courts for salt disputes, like sections of the Chambre du Gabelle, were established specifically to handle Gabelle-related crimes. They aim to expedite convictions and maintain the flow of revenue to royal coffers. Officials reasoned that swift justice was the best deterrent, hoping fear would keep the populace in line. Yet, for every stern judge determined to uphold the law, there's also the labyrinth of local alliances and vested interests. A wealthy merchant might bribe a clerk to misplace evidence. A sympathetic magistrate could show leniency to a widow caught bartering a pinch of salt with her neighbor. Not to mention, these courts were often overloaded, each session a parade of anxious defendants. The machine creaks under its own weight. Historians still argue whether the monarchy's intention was genuine enforcement or if these spectacles merely served to scare people into compliance. Whichever the case, the outcome is a muddled process, one that rarely quells salt crime effectively despite the monarchy's best efforts. While observing a particularly tense hearing, you notice the defendant, a lanky farmer, who stands before the judge, hat in hand. He's accused of possessing contraband salt in quantities exceeding personal need. His voice quivers as he insists he's done nothing wrong, but the official brandishes a ledger, detailing just how many grams above the limit he was caught with. The spectacle feels almost absurd. You half expect a comedic moment, where the farmer rummages through his pockets and says, "Oops, must have slipped in there next to my lucky pebble." But the gravity is real. If found guilty, he could face crushing fines or a stint in the local jail. That's no joke for someone who can barely afford a sack of grain. You catch hushed remarks from the gallery. Someone jokes that soon the courts will start sniffing people's clothes to see if they smell too salty. Another jokes that the monarchy might fund a new position: official salt sniffer, complete with a fancy uniform and a gold-plated nose clip. It's gallows humor, really. But the frustration is palpable. The populace feels they're dancing on eggshells, uncertain how heavily the law might fall on them. A quirky tidbit you overhear in a side corridor: a rumor that one cunning defendant once arrived in court with a donkey laden with old sacks, each meticulously labeled, "not salt." Everyone in the chamber burst out laughing. The donkey even brayed on cue, as if mocking the entire process. Legend has it the donkey's performance so flustered the officials that the defendant was let off with only a warning. Whether or not this yarn is genuine, you can't help but picture the comedic spectacle: robes fluttering, judges sputtering, and that donkey's triumphant tail swish. Outside, in the courtyard, lawyers hustle between hearings, parchment packets tucked under their arms. One corners you, launching into a speech about how the entire legal system is at odds with itself. The monarchy wants harsh sentences to terrify potential criminals, but local judges, people who know the day-to-day struggles of peasant life, often hand down more lenient rulings. Then there's the matter of bribes, nepotism, and general confusion over contradictory edicts. You sense that if the monarchy built a giant scale to weigh every ounce of salt in the realm, the bureaucracy would topple under its own complexity. You wander further, eventually encountering a smaller hearing room where a group of 5 defendants stands in a line. Their charges vary from minor infractions, carrying slightly more salt than permitted, to orchestrating entire smuggling operations. This range of salt crime lumps together the petty and the serious, further complicating the court's ability to deliver consistent verdicts. One might receive a stiff fine, while the next could be sent to the gallows, depending on which official is presiding or how sympathetic the jury feels that day. It makes you wonder, if salt is so vital, shouldn't there be a more measured approach? The monarchy, however, is in no mood for philosophical debates when money is on the line. A comedic break surfaces when a flustered prosecutor accidentally sneezes mid-argument. The cause: a poorly sealed evidence bag of salt. It's one of those ironic moments that underscores how absurdly central salt has become in these proceedings. The giggles from the audience earn them a stern glare from the judge. But the tension breaks momentarily. Outside the windows, you hear a lone bird chirp, as if adding its own commentary to the day's events. Overhearing a scribe's conversation, you learn that this legal mess slows the courts to a crawl. Cases pile up, defendants languish in overcrowded jails awaiting trial, and the monarchy demands faster resolutions. The scribe even jokes, at this rate, we'll need a separate kingdom just for all these salt cases. When you consider that France is simultaneously dealing with other social strains, food shortages, class resentments, and that persistent glimmer of revolutionary ideas, it becomes crystal clear that the monarchy's fixation on the Gabelle is stirring more resentment than compliance. Of course, some folks see the court proceedings as a twisted form of entertainment, like the 18th century version of a dramatic courtroom show. They gather, eager to watch the unfolding spectacle, rooting for the underdog or placing bets on whether an official will stumble over legal jargon. But behind that veneer of spectacle lies real suffering. Each sentence can shatter a family's livelihood. A father sent to prison means a farm left untended, children forced to beg. The cycle of poverty tightens, fueling more desperation, and ultimately, more law-breaking. As the day's hearings wind to a close, you pass a cluster of exhausted lawyers packing up their scrolls and inkpots. One complains that all this fuss over salt is overshadowing bigger concerns about land rights and fair wages. But hey, he quips, I'll keep taking these cases. At least it pays the bills. His colleague smirks, retorting, yeah, but if they tax us on the tears we shed reading these verdicts, we'll be bankrupt by next month. It's a dark little joke, but you sense it expresses how relentless and inescapable the salt question has become. As you leave the courthouse, the late afternoon sun stretches shadows across the stone steps. The crowd thins, defendants disperse, and the building's stern facade looms overhead like a silent sentinel of authority. Legal proceedings might quell some of the salt smuggling, but clearly they don't solve the underlying resentment. In fact, each trial you witness only seems to deepen the frustration. You step away, mentally cataloging the day's mixture of solemnity and farce, aware that these courts, designed to maintain order, are themselves tangled in the monarchy's ill-conceived quest for revenue. Maybe the monarchy assumes fear will keep everyone in check. Maybe local judges hope small mercies can diffuse the tension. But no one seems to grasp that the more they tighten their grip, the more people slip through their fingers, determined to find a way around the Gabelle. You glance back at the heavy wooden doors one last time, wondering how long this precarious system can endure. For now, the building stands tall, a testament to the monarchy's power. Still, in your mind, you hear the echo of that donkey's brazen bray, and you can't shake the feeling that a much larger disruption is waiting just around the corner. Leaving the echoing corridors of courtrooms behind, you gravitate toward a different kind of solemn space, the local church. High arched ceilings, rows of wooden pews, and stained glass windows filtering colored light across the stone floor. In 18th century France, religion remains deeply woven into everyday life. Yet for all its spiritual authority, the church also has material ties to the wider realm. That means it can't avoid mingling with the Gabelle and the burdens of taxation. You enter a chapel during the lull of midday, when most parishioners have returned to their homes or fields. A lone figure is kneeling near the altar, a farmer's wife, judging by her weathered hands clasped in prayer. Her whispers echo slightly in the stillness, and you catch phrases of hope, a plea for her family's livelihood, a request for forgiveness for skirting the salt laws. You sense the torment of someone who's simply trying to put food on the table while staying within church teachings. After all, feeding your children is no small moral imperative. One can't help but note the tension between obeying civil law and the higher calling of caring for loved ones. Rising from a side alcove, a priest with gentle eyes and a worn cassock greets you. He shares that, despite the church's spiritual role, it's also entangled in the economic struggles of the countryside. You recall that tithers, typically 1/10 of a parishioner's produce, contribute to the church's coffers. A mainstream historical fact emerges. Not only did peasants owe taxes to the monarchy, they were also expected to pay tithes to the church, which could include farm produce, money, and in some cases, salt. That's right, salt even sneaks into religious obligations. One can imagine how difficult it becomes when the Gabelle already pins people's wallets to the wall. As you wander toward the vestry, the priest explains that while many clergymen sympathize with the plight of their congregations, the higher ranks of the church may have a different perspective. After all, bishops and archbishops often mingle with nobles, and some hold land subject to the same complicated tax structure. So, while a humble village priest might turn a blind eye, if a few sacks of contraband salt help a starving family, an ambitious Monsignor might lobby for stricter enforcement to safeguard church revenues and maintain favor with the monarchy. Historians still argue whether the institutional church as a whole leaned more toward supporting royal authority or defending the common folk. The truth, you suspect, was tangled, like threads of a tapestry knotted behind the scenes. Stepping through a modest door, you find yourself in the rectory's garden, a quiet space with neatly trimmed hedges and herbs sprouting in orderly rows. The priest picks a sprig of thyme and hands it to you, remarking that even a small herb garden can be precious, especially in a world where salt is expensive. You catch the hint. Without enough salt to preserve and season, even the bounty of a good harvest can sour quickly. He shares a quirky tidbit, a local legend of a traveling monk who tried to bless sea waves to remove their salt, hoping to provide free salt water for everyone. Naturally, it didn't work, but the story endures as a testament to the desperation people felt, willing to believe even in miraculous shortcuts. Inside the adjoining kitchen, an old pot simmers on the hearth, the gentle bubble echoing the warmth of the fire. The aroma of lentils and onions wafts through the air, a simple meal that depends on a dash of salt to transform it from bland to hearty. The priest confesses that some families, short on legally obtained salt, will come to him and ask for leftover, blessed salt, which the church uses in certain rites. He's torn. It's not intended for cooking, but can he really deny a hungry neighbor? You sense the moral quandary. If an institution is meant to care for souls, how does it handle the physical needs tangled in oppressive taxation? Before you can linger on this too long, the church bells toll softly, an echo that calls the faithful to gather for a midday prayer. They filter in, one by one. Farmers, weavers, children with bare feet, a wary merchant. During the sermon, the priest addresses the trials of daily life, urging patience and compassion. It's a gentle exhortation that manages not to mention the Gabelle outright, but you can read between the lines. The church is telling people to bear their burdens, to trust in divine providence, even as secular authority insists on more taxes. You spy a few parishioners with tight, lipped expressions that say, "Patience alone won't fill our empty plates." After the service, small clusters of villagers linger. They exchange whispers about the salt tax, hinting at new rumors, an upcoming crackdown, a possible smuggling route, an unconfirmed talk of a local official accepting bribes. A man jokes that perhaps they should excommunicate the king if he keeps raising taxes. The remark draws nervous laughter. Poking fun at the monarchy might be tolerated in private, but no one wants to test the boundaries of blasphemy or treason. You realize how precariously these villagers balance on the tightrope between religious devotion and secular law. Not all clergy offer leniency. Some firebrand preachers, enthralled by traditional authority, demand obedience, citing scriptures about rendering unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. If the crown claims taxes, these preachers argue, the people must submit. A cynical glint in your eye notes that these preachers often enjoy comfortable rectories and close ties to local officials. But the church, like the rest of society, isn't a monolith. Many simple priests witness their parishioners, was first-hand children coughing through winters, families torn apart by Gabelle, related arrests. Compassion and practicality compel them to turn a blind eye to minor infractions, or at least not denounce them from the pulpit. In a small corner near the stained glass window, you spot a cluster of nuns busy rolling out dough. One is quietly humming a hymn, while the others measure out ingredients with meticulous care. Less flour here, a dash more water there. Their conversation drifts your way. They lament how the convent's modest resources force them to ration salt, which compromises the flavor of bread they provide to the poor. One wryly suggests they rename their loaves royal rations, poking fun at how everything seems linked to the crown's policies. It's a tiny act of rebellion cloaked in charity work. As you pass by the confessional booth, a single figure slips out, eyes downcast, possibly unburdened from confessing a salt sin. The transformation is subtle, but you sense relief in their posture. Maybe they admitted to purchasing a few ounces of contraband salt. Will they do it again? The odds are high. Feeding your family carries moral weight that even the threat of legal repercussions can't eclipse. The final chime of the bells signals the end of your visit. You walk past the weathered statue of a saint, carved centuries ago, standing watch over this complex interplay of faith, duty, and survival. Salt and the church might seem an unlikely combination, but here, side by side, they mold the daily routines and moral choices of an entire community. You catch one last glimpse of the priest, who stepped outside to gaze at a distant field. He appears lost in thought, perhaps mulling how to serve both his congregation and the dictates of a kingdom that taxes its people to the brink. In your mind, you can almost see the conflicting symbols, the cross and the salt shaker, each commanding loyalty in different ways. Leaving the courtyard, you sense a deeper understanding of why people turn to both faith and cunning, prayer and protest. When the burden of the Gabelle grows too heavy, the church can't wholly escape worldly economics, and the monarchy can't fully control spiritual devotion. And caught in the middle are ordinary folks, trying to reconcile the need to survive with the call to obey the law. and keep faith. As you step onto the dusty road once more, you can't help but marvel at how something as ordinary as salt has infiltrated every corner of life, from the kneeling penitent to the sturdy priest at the altar. You trudge along a narrow dirt lane, the afternoon sun beating down as you recall the uneasy balance of churchly compassion and royal edicts. Ahead, a small village comes into view, typical of rural 18th century France, with its cluster of low, roofed cottages, a modest well in the center square, and wandering livestock poking about. At first glance, it's hardly the setting for anything you'd call a rebellion. But tonight, you'll see signs of small defiant acts glimmering just beneath the surface, like sparks waiting for a gust of wind. As you walk closer, you notice a handful of villagers gathered by a crumbling stone wall. They speak in low tones, occasionally erupting into brief laughter, before quickly lowering their voices again. One older woman jabs the tip of her cane into the dirt, leaving a small impression. "One day, that's where I'll bury these taxes!" she jokes, eliciting a round of quiet chuckles. It's the first whiff of rebellion, light-hearted, perhaps, but loaded with pent-up frustration. You sense that these people aren't exactly hatching a grand coup d'état. Instead, they perform subtle acts of pushback, the kind that would make a tax collector roll his eyes if he saw them, or maybe raise an eyebrow in concern. You continue through the village and come upon a row of homes. Outside one, a man is meticulously scraping something off a wooden sign. As you draw nearer, you realize he's removing a freshly painted notice that announces the official salt rate for the month. When he spots you, he freezes, paint scraper in hand, eyes wide like a child caught filching sweets. A moment later, he shrugs and quips, "Sorry, friend. Guess I'm not tall enough to scrape the king off his high horse." It's a small act of vandalism, but it's also a symbolic gesture. If you can't force the monarchy to change its rules, you can at least erase them from your doorstep. Further down the lane, you pass a bakery. A mouth-watering aroma of fresh bread wafts out, but there's tension in the air. An elderly baker leans across the counter toward a young woman, explaining his new day, old bread discount. Code for bread that's less salty, and thus less likely to rouse official suspicion. He winks, pressing a loaf into her hands. The woman beams as if she's just received a secret treasure. You realize that by using less salt, the baker dodges some of the mandated quotas, and in turn, can charge less. It's a quiet revolt, a spoonful of rebellion baked right into the dough. A mainstream historical fact underscores this daily friction in certain provinces. People were legally required to buy a fixed minimum of salt each year from official depots. Failing to purchase your quota could result in penalties, even if you didn't actually need that much salt, so villagers found endless small ways to undercut these mandates, like pooling resources to buy one share, then dividing it among multiple households, or forging the depot's purchase records. Not exactly the stuff of dramatic battles, but each minor scheme adds to a mounting dissatisfaction with royal authority. As you wander on, your attention is drawn to a makeshift notice board plastered on the side of a smithy. Bits of parchment flutter in the breeze, pinned by crooked nails. One letter catches your eye, a rant scrawled in a wobbly hand, mocking the monarchy for prizing salt more than its own subjects. Here's a thought, the writer suggests. Maybe the next coronation can feature a parade of salt shakers instead of knights. You can't help but smile at the mental image of bedazzled salt shakers rolling past cheering crowds. It's absurd, yes, but it reveals that satire has become a powerful weapon in these villages, a subtle form of protest that ridicules the very notion of a salt tax. Quiet though they are, these small acts carry real risks. You pass by a modest cottage whose windows remain shuttered even in midday. Someone whispers that the occupant used to host salt smuggling meetups in her cellar. She was caught a month ago and hauled before the courts. They say she came home changed, fearful, reclusive, her spirit quashed by threats of further punishment. The monarchy might ignore petty jokes, but repeated violations, or publicly defiant attitudes, can land you in serious trouble. You get the sense that for every successful act of quiet rebellion, there's at least one cautionary tale. Still, villagers persist. Over at the communal well, a group of women chat while filling buckets. They compare notes on ways to stretch the salt, like salting only certain parts of their meat, or cooking larger batches to use fewer seasonings. One woman shares a secret technique for substituting dried herbs to enhance flavor without the pricey crystals. When another complains that the monarchy will probably tax thyme and rosemary next, they burst into laughter. In that moment, the well becomes a minor center of revolution, filled with hushed camaraderie rather than open revolt. it's easy to underestimate these tiny, day-to-day rebellions. But in a kingdom as vast as France, the monarchy can't keep tabs on every pot of stew or every signpost that's mysteriously scratched out. Historians still argue whether these acts were the real tender for larger unrest or merely symptoms of a discontent already brewing across the social landscape. Either way, you sense that a chain reaction is forming, small gestures stacking up, feeding into a broader wave of resentment that might soon overpower the king's salt-hungry treasury. By evening, a gentle twilight settles over the village. Children chase each other around in a game you might recognize as a variation of tag. Only here, you overhear them squealing about, "You're the taxman!" As if it's the worst fate imaginable. You can't help but grin at how even the games reflect the climate being is akin to collecting salt taxes from unsuspecting victims. A mother calls her little ones inside, reminding them that bedtime is near. Even in this quiet ritual, you see the shadow of the Gabelle lurking. For how many parents fret over whether they'll have enough salted provisions to feed their families through the next pay cycle? A quirky tidbit surfaces in conversation with a local tailor. He claims that in a nearby town, villagers created a mock carnival float, an enormous salt shaker on wheels. They'd parade it through the streets each year, chanting playful rhymes about sprinkling justice on the monarchy. This tradition supposedly started when one intrepid blacksmith hammered an old barrel into the shape of a salt shaker, then dressed it with scraps of tin so it shimmered in the sun. The carnival garnered a huge crowd. Some cheered, others giggled nervously, and a few were outraged at such open mockery of royal policy. Regardless, the comedic spectacle lived on. Night falls, the sky darkening into a canopy of stars. You find yourself drawn to a small bonfire near the edge of the village, where a handful of locals huddle against the chill. They pass around a jug of cider, the smell tart and inviting, and trade stories of sabotage and cunning. One man recounts how he once gave false directions to a tax official. Another brags about playing a mild prank. He and some buddies switched the official salt depot sign with a decoy sign that pointed to a pigsty. The image of a pompous tax agent marching into a pigpen, scowling at muddy snouts, lights up the circle with laughter. For a moment, you forget the ever-present weight of the monarchy's system, lost in the glow of communal spirit. Yet as the embers die down, the laughter subsides. The quiet night air brings sobering thoughts. Jokes and pranks might ease tensions, but they don't erase the fact that tomorrow morning, the Gabelle remains in force. The monarchy still expects compliance, and for all these small acts of defiance, the villagers know that real change may require more than sneaky pranks and carnival floats. A wave of exhaustion seems to pass over them, as though even rebellious acts take their toll. You slip away into the darkness, footsteps crunching softly on dirt paths. In the windows of the cottages, you see faint candlelight. Families going through bedtime rituals, perhaps sprinkling the very last pinch of salt onto a simple dinner. It's a tiny scene repeated across the country, bound by an undercurrent of resentment that might yet boil over. For now, though, these spoonfuls of rebellion keep morale alive, planting the seeds of something bigger. And as you settle into your own resting spot under the stars, you wonder how long these gentle sparks will remain harmless flickers, and when they might become a roaring fire that transforms the entire realm. You wake the next morning with the faint memory of yesterday's small rebellions dancing in your mind. Scraped signs, carnival floats, and quiet jabs at the salt tax. As the sun peaks over rolling fields, you continue on your winding path until you reach a lively crossroads. Merchants are arriving from different regions, and the air vibrates with snatches of conversation. You notice that while some folks keep their voices down, others speak quite boldly, as though fueled by a growing sense that the monarchy's salt policy is more fragile than it appears. You find yourself lingering near a cluster of travelers, discussing the broader unrest that seems to seep into every corner of the kingdom. One of them, an amateur scholar with an ink-stained vest, confidently declares, "The salt tax is just the tip of the spear. It's not the only reason people are angry, but it might be the one that pokes them to finally do something." Another traveler counters, "Yes, but historians still argue whether the Gabelle itself was crucial or if it was merely symbolic, a convenient rallying cry for deeper frustrations about feudal dues, food shortages, and social inequality." The conversation brims with intensity, even though they're all trying to stay low-key about it. After all, you never know who might be listening. As you approach, you notice a tradesman reading from a worn pamphlet. It's filled with text analyzing the monarchy's finances. Debts from wars, lavish court expenses, the patchwork of regional taxes. He grumbles that salt might be a small part of the monarchy's overall scheme, but it's such a daily necessity that it hits people squarely in their dinner plates. You can hide a property tax, he says, but try telling a mother she can't salt her family's soup. Then you'll see real anger. You sense a spark in his eye, one that signals how this conversation is happening all across France. Maybe not in the open streets of Paris yet, but certainly in every village, tavern and market stall. Just then, a middle-aged woman carrying bundles of cloth chimes in. But let's not pretend it's the only cause. Bread prices are high, wages too low. The monarchy has been piling burdens on us for years. The salt tax is just the final straw. Another man nods, adding wryly, a final straw as salty as the sea, if you ask me. You stifle a small laugh. Sometimes, a briny sense of humor is just what's needed in grim times. One mainstream historical fact emerges from their debate. A broader climate of fiscal pressure had been building for decades, and the monarchy leaned heavily on all sorts of indirect taxes. Tobacco, wine, stamps, and more. Yet none seemed to provoke quite the universal annoyance as the Gabelle. This crucial staple of daily life became a lightning rod, intensifying frustrations that might otherwise have smoldered quietly. It's as if every grudge people held against the monarchy found a common focus, in that single crystal salt. You slip into the conversation, listening to a self-proclaimed intellectual who has apparently spent time in various provincial archives. He boasts about reading musty documents that trace the monarchy's attempts to unify the tax system. They wanted to standardize salt rates nationwide, he explains, but that fiasco sparked more anger. Suddenly, some regions lost their traditional exemptions and had to pay steeper prices overnight. One quirky tidbit he mentions, in a small coastal province, locals passed around a superstition that burying a salted fish at midnight under a full moon would curse the tax collectors with perpetual hiccups. He claims this particular ritual caused a shortage of salted fish for 2 entire summers, though it's likely just village gossip. Still, you can't help but grin at the image of officials hiccuping themselves senseless. Someone else jumps in, highlighting that historians still argue whether any single injustice, like the salt tax, could spark a revolution. Some think the monarchy's downfall had more to do with Enlightenment ideas spreading among the middle classes. Others contend that day-to-day suffering under regressive taxes gave a tangible focus for anger, driving people to demand broader change. Perhaps it's both. Ideas matter, one man says, but if your stomach is empty, you might care less about fancy philosophy and more about toppling whoever's preventing you from filling your bowl with salted stew. At that, a stout grey-haired woman snorts. And when the monarchy runs out of coins, they'll just invent another tax. I hear rumors they plan to tax beards next. She lets out a boisterous laugh, and a few passers-by shoot her startled glances. You can't help but giggle, imagining the monarchy painstakingly measuring beard lengths to levy a follicle fee. Sure, it's a ridiculous joke, but with this regime, you never know. As midday approaches, the crowd at the crossroads grows. Merchants hawk vegetables and fruits, while a blacksmith clangs away at horseshoes. People weave between stalls, occasionally pausing to debate politics in hushed clusters. A farmer waves you over to admire his produce, and between sales, he mutters that the monarchy wouldn't be in such debt if it didn't bankroll endless wars and royal extravagances. It's a sentiment you've heard countless times by now, but every new voice adds to the choir. The monarchy's priorities are dangerously misaligned with the realities of life in the provinces. You spy a small group gathered around a wooden crate, which serves as a makeshift podium for a traveling preacher. He's sermonizing about moral integrity and fairness. But here's the twist: after each religious reference, he ties it back to the idea that people shouldn't be overburdened by earthly rulers who fail to uphold justice. When the law becomes a yoke too heavy, he proclaims, the good folk may question who truly stands for righteousness. It's a subtle dig at the monarchy, suggesting that unjust taxation borders on sinfulness. You wonder how long he'll get away with this sermon before a local official shoos him off. You remember the question that's been floating in every tavern and workshop. Is salt truly the root of all this discontent, or merely a symbol of a larger pattern of royal mismanagement? A passing peddler answers that question in his own style. Salt is where it starts, he says, but I hear folks in the city are restless about bread prices, about feudal dues, about everything. So what's next? A big march on Paris, pitchforks and all? Or will they do something more cunning, like refuse the tax collectively? He shrugs, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. Or Maybe we all just keep complaining until something bigger forces a change. You step away from the crowds and find a shady spot under an oak tree at the edge of the crossroads. The air here is cooler, and you let your mind piece together the morning's swirl of discussions. There's no single consensus. Some folks see the salt tax as a stand-in for bigger injustices. Others believe it's the actual cause of their hardships, overshadowing all else. The monarchy, in a sense, is leaving a gift to future historians, a messy puzzle with scattered pieces: debt, war, extravagance, inequality, misguided policies. And somewhere in the middle, the Gabelle glints like a stubborn shard of glass, cutting everyone who grasps at it. In an idle moment, you overhear a pair of old friends reminiscing. They recall that their grandparents spoke of a time when salt taxes weren't so high and life felt simpler. But that was before the wars, before the king's third expansion of palace gardens. One says, rolling his eyes. The other friend quips, and before some genius decided that we peasants have pockets deep enough to carry the entire kingdom on our backs. They share a resigned chuckle, a soft acknowledgement that while nostalgia doesn't solve current problems, it offers a brief respite. With the afternoon sun overhead, the bustle at the crossroads begins to thin out. Merchants pack their carts, and travelers resume their journeys. That sense of suppressed energy you felt earlier lingers, as if everyone is heading home to continue these debates around dinner tables and farmland fences. You sense that the talk about the salt tax has deeper meaning. The underlying anger at a system that bleeds the many for the benefit of the few will keep growing, like a gathering storm on the horizon. You take a final look at the clearing. A faint wind rustles the leaves of the oak tree, and you feel a cooling breeze on your face. In your mind, you imagine the swirling voices of historians yet unborn, arguing passionately about whether salt was the true catalyst for France's transformation. Perhaps it's not about picking one cause, but recognizing that in a society stretched to its limits, even something as ordinary as salt can become the final push that sets events in motion. You stand, stepping away from the tree's shade, ready to keep moving. The path ahead is uncertain, but you carry a realization as simple and enduring as salt itself sometimes. The smallest grains of discontent can topple the mightiest of structures. If given enough time and enough voices, you walk onward, feet stirring up puffs of dust as you leave the crossroads behind. The warmth of the day clings to your skin, and you can sense a brewing intensity in the air. Like the stillness before a thunderstorm, word spreads faster than a traveling minstrel. Peasants in scattered pockets of France are doing more than just grumbling or staging miniature pranks. They're beginning to rise up in direct defiance of the salt tax. Little clusters of rebellion are popping up like mushrooms after rainfall, and you can't shake the feeling that all those hushed complaints and sly jokes have finally ignited something bigger. Your path leads through farmland dotted with small hamlets. The first sign that something has changed arrives in the form of scorched wood planks, remnants of a modest tax collector's outpost. You come across a pair of villagers who are busy stamping out the last embers, their clothes streaked with soot. Didn't take much to set it ablaze, one man says, leaning on a charred beam. He doesn't sound triumphant, more resigned, as if this dramatic outburst was long overdue. The other villager, cheeks still flushed with adrenaline, adds, "We've had enough." They come around demanding salt quotas, year after year, and never once ask if we can afford it. Stories of open defiance greet you at every bend. One traveling tinker tells you about a northern village that barricaded its main road to keep out the Gabelle enforcers. Another rumor says a group of farmers near the coast dumped sacks of official salt into the sea, an almost comical gesture, as if returning the taxed mineral from whence it came. You can't help but picture tax agents standing on the shore, jaws slack, watching their precious commodity dissolve in the rolling waves. Quirky or not, these stories reflect a critical turning point. Peasants no longer see quiet sabotage as enough. They're moving into public acts of resistance. A mainstream historical fact resonates. By the late 18th century, local revolts against the salt tax flared up in various provinces, sometimes overlapping with broader riots over grain shortages. As you trace your steps through these troubled regions, you notice that the salt question becomes a lightning rod, unifying different complaints. Bread prices, feudal dues, corrupt officials, into one rallying cry. Down with the Gabelle might sound narrow in scope, but behind those words, people express a yearning for fairness that extends far beyond a single tax. In one village square, you arrive just as a ragged assembly of farmers is debating whether to march on the nearby town. Their plan: to confront the local salt warehouse and demand either a reduced price or the warehouse manager's removal. The air crackles with tension. A few hold pitchforks, others clench torches. You half expect someone to break into a rousing chant, but they seem uncertain, fired up, yet jittery. "We're not soldiers," mutters a young man, staring at the pitchfork in his hands as though it's an alien object. An older woman, her hair tied back with a tattered scarf, retorts, "No, but we're hungry." And anger can turn even a ragtag bunch into a force to reckon with. Historians still argue whether these localized revolts were spontaneous or loosely coordinated. You pick up murmurings that travelers carried news from village to village, sometimes exaggerating tales of successful uprisings, which inspired others to follow suit. There's no grand blueprint, no single revolutionary council orchestrating every action, yet the sense of shared grievance unites them. It's like watching sparks jump between dry tinder piles, each cluster erupting in its own small blaze, but collectively illuminating a much bigger fire. You wander into the next town just as a small crowd forms near the official salt storehouse. Armed guards have barricaded the entrance, but the crowd's energy is unmistakable. Chants, raised voices, banners scrawled with mockery. One banner reads, "We need salt for soup, not a palace for a king." Another, "When the salt is gone, so is our patience." You catch a faint whiff of tension in the air, the same metallic taste you get right before a summer storm. Guards shift uneasily, gripping their muskets. A few local officials stand behind them, pale-faced, possibly hoping the crowd's rage will cool before anything snaps. Suddenly, someone hurls a stone. It thumps against the wooden door of the warehouse. The guards stiffen, and an uneasy hush falls over the crowd, like a collective intake of breath. Then another stone flies. A guard shouts a warning, but his voice trembles, uncertain whether to crack down or stand aside. One comedic moment emerges in the chaos. A man in the crowd lifts a wooden spoon overhead, roaring, "This spoon can't stir a pot without salt! Let us in or face the spoon's wrath!" There's a burst of laughter, though tinged with desperation. Who knew wooden utensils could symbolize defiance? But jokes aside, you see how quickly these gatherings can teeter into violence. A scuffle breaks out at the warehouse entrance, men wrestling with guards, and someone's torch sets a small pile of straw ablaze. People shriek, scattering to stomp out the flames. It's a scene of confusion. Nobody quite knows if they want to burn the warehouse or seize it, or simply force a negotiation. In the end, local authorities promise to relay the people's demands to higher-ups. The crowd grudgingly disperses, the tension only half satisfied. Such episodes repeat across the land. In some places, peasants actually manage to raid salt storehouses, distributing the seized goods among themselves in a chaotic version of Robin Hood. In others, the monarchy dispatches troops or official dragoons to quell disturbances. A rumor swirls that a troop commander told his men, "Don't kill them, just scare them back into obedience." But fear and rifles rarely mix cleanly. You hear of injuries, even deaths, in scattered confrontations, yet the anger simmers on. A quirky tidbit surfaces in conversation with a wandering bard. He claims that one band of revolution-minded peasants donned costumes made from burlap sacks, each painted to look like giant salt crystals. They paraded through their local market, chanting rhymes poking fun at the monarchy's greed. While it sounds fantastical, you've already seen enough bizarre twists in this drama to believe that someone, somewhere, embraced protest through goofy theatrics. People need humor in dark times. Laughter can be a weapon all its own. Moving away from the crowds, you pass quiet farmland turned sullen by tension. Local lords, if they still have illusions that they control these lands without question, are beginning to worry. Unchecked anger directed at the salt tax could become a direct challenge to broader feudal authority. Some might recall the small acts of dissent you witnessed earlier, scraped signs, hidden salt stashes, local pranks, and realize that these were the first cracks in a dam that's now threatening to burst. You picture a noble trembling in his manner, anxiously wondering if the peasants will show up at his door next. You cross a rickety wooden bridge spanning a shallow river. On the far bank, you notice torn posters warning of dire punishments for anyone caught participating in lawful gatherings. The monarchy is trying to stem the tide of revolt with proclamations and threats. But words on paper can't douse a flame that's fueled by hunger and desperation. For every official notice, there's another mocking pamphlet or a rumor of a village that chased away the tax collectors. Where once people cowered, now they question. It's a shift in mindset, as if the weight of the Gabelle has broken the last vestige of submissive acceptance. In the gathering dusk, you see silhouettes crossing the fields, lanterns bobbing like fireflies. You imagine families huddled in their cottages, breathlessly swapping the latest news of uprisings in far-off regions, emboldened by stories of victory, disheartened by tales of brutal crackdowns, yet propelled forward by the simple truth that they cannot stand the salt tax any longer. Perhaps they're forging new alliances. Farmers talking to artisans, villagers connecting with outlying hamlets, quietly orchestrating the next step in their quest to break free from the monarchy's crushing demands. You sense that these revolts, though scattered, are sowing seeds that might yet flower into something much larger. Walking down the moonlit path, you hear the echo of distant voices. Protests continuing under cover of night, the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer, forging who knows what? Maybe pikes or pitchforks for the next confrontation. The monarchy can't be everywhere at once, and the people have learned that in numbers, they have power. With each new spark of rebellion, the question looms: how much longer can the kingdom remain intact before these local insurrections merge into a force that demands not just a tweak to taxes, but a rethinking of the entire social order? For now, you let the night wrap around you like a soft blanket. The day's chaos and passion swirl in your mind, a heady mix of defiance, anxiety, and determination. You marvel that salt, a simple mineral we sprinkle, without a second thought in modern times, could unleash such turmoil. But if history has taught you anything, it's that no resource is truly simple. When power and survival are at stake, your footsteps slow, the tension easing in your shoulders, as you accept that the storm is far from over. And when it finally breaks, it may sweep away more than just a burdensome tax. You awaken to a subdued hush rippling through the countryside, like the moment after a thunderous downpour when the wind stirs restless branches, hinting that the storm might circle back. Only this time, instead of talk of raids and burning storehouses, you hear hesitant rumors of change wafting on the breeze. Whispers of reform, they call them. Half the people you meet greet these whispers with guarded hope, the other half with a sarcastic eye roll that says, "We'll believe it when we see it." You trudge into a modest market square at midday. Usually, the stalls would be bustling with produce. Apples, root vegetables, bundles of herbs, but the mood feels cautious. A local tannery worker huddles with a few townsfolk, passing around a well-worn piece of parchment. You manage to catch a glimpse of the Inca proposed revision to the salt tax, rumored to have come from a lower-level council sympathetic to the peasants' plight. No official seal graces the document, just a shaky signature from some bureaucrat claiming the monarchy might consider lowering salt quotas or creating new exemptions. Maybe the king finally listened to our prayers, a woman remarks, hugging her shawl as though it shields her from the possibility of disappointment. Her neighbor, an older man with a wiry mustache, snorts. Prayers, more like they're terrified of more fires. His skepticism is as thick as day-old stew, and you can't blame him. After so many empty promises, words on a flimsy parchment aren't exactly a signed royal decree. A mainstream historical fact underscores this delicate moment by the late 1780s. The monarchy was indeed flirting with small-scale reforms, partly to prevent widespread revolt and partly to address the kingdom's ballooning financial crisis. You recall that King Louis XVI commissioned various councils and appointed advisors who recommended easing certain taxes, including the Gabelle. Yet each proposal got tangled in political inertia, with nobles fretting they'd lose privileges, and the monarchy itself terrified that once you open the door to reform, you might not be able to close it again. Historians still argue whether these measures might have saved the old regime if implemented sooner, or if discontent had already reached a point of no return. As you wander past a row of timber-framed houses, you hear hushed conversations at every doorstep. Have you heard about the plan? Is it genuine? Or just another rumor? I'll believe it when I see the king himself carrying salt to my doorstep, free of charge. It's in these little jokes and eye rolls that you sense both cynicism and a flicker of hope. One man jokes that maybe the monarchy will introduce a salt rebate day, where peasants line up to receive a pinch of royal goodwill. Another wryly adds, yes, and perhaps they'll give out gold bars with your daily bread. The group bursts into uneasy laughter, as if they're trying to laugh off the absurdity of expecting any real relief. Continuing through the village, you come across a small tavern with a battered wooden sign swinging overhead. Curiosity drives you inside, where the midday crowd is abuzz. Here, rumor flows as liberally as the diluted wine, painting vivid pictures of possible reforms. I heard they'll halve the salt tax, declares a burly man in a leather apron, pounding the table with triumphant glee. A slender woman across from him narrows her eyes. Halve it, or rename it and keep it the same. Her skepticism hits like a cold splash of water. Indeed, the monarchy is known for rebranding taxes. Call it a salt contribution instead of a salt tax, and maybe folks won't notice the difference. One comedic rumor claims that if the monarchy can't quell the anger, they might blame it all on a rogue official, someone they can easily fire while keeping the system mostly intact. You picture a hapless bureaucrat with a fancy wig, scapegoated for crimes he only half committed. At a corner table, a traveling notary with ink, stained fingers and tired eyes is laying out the specifics. They're talking about forming a commission. He mutters, which is basically a group of aristocrats debating how to keep collecting revenue without inciting more chaos. He takes a swig of weak ale and adds, "Some of the more progressive voices want to unify the salt rates and reduce the overall burden, but the old guard says that's too risky. They can't just surrender that revenue, especially with all the debts from war, so it's gridlock as usual." You eavesdrop further apparently. Local officials in a few regions have taken it upon themselves to implement small relief measures. Slight reduction in mandatory salt quotas, or a grace period on fines if peasants show they're trying to comply. These half-hearted fixes might placate some pockets of rebellion, but in places with fiercer uprisings, talk of concessions only stokes the flames. You see, a rough-voiced laborer says, they're scared. Now's the time to push harder. Maybe we can get rid of the Gabelle for good. His mates nod in agreement, galvanizing each other's conviction that real change is within grasp. One quirky tidbit emerges from a chatty merchant who claims that a radical pamphleteer in Paris has been penning satirical letters signed Monsieur Sel, which means Mr. Salt. These letters poke fun at how the monarchy clutches the salt tax like a mezza hoarding coins, predicting that the crown will soon need to tax the sweat on workers' brows. The pamphlets have become underground bestsellers, smuggled into taverns and read aloud in hushed gatherings, fueling the notion that the monarchy's policies are not only unjust but downright comical in their greed. Whether or not you believe every rumor, the fact that people are devouring satire about the monarchy is telling. Nothing signals dissatisfaction like a thriving black market for political humor. Historians still argue whether the monarchy's reluctant attempts at reform were sincere or merely a ruse to buy time. Some scholars assert the monarchy hoped to unify salt taxes in a more equitable manner, but faced sabotage from nobles who didn't want to lose their local privileges. Others suggest that, even if the monarchy had tried a thorough overhaul, it might have been too late. Distrust had seeped too deeply into the peasant consciousness. By now, any royal edict is met with suspicion. Yes, but what's the catch? From the tavern, you step back into the sunlight, noticing the sky turning a pale, washed-out hue, like anticipation stretched taut. Down the main street, you spot a small group of peasants huddled around a notice board, where a brand new proclamation flutters in the mild wind. You make your way over, weaving through onlookers. The royal crest adorns the top of the parchment, and the text outlines a temporary relief measure for those in dire need. Read the fine print, warns an old woman with a hand on her hip. Sure enough, there's a list of caveats long enough to fill a ledger. Only certain parishes qualify, only up to a limited amount of salt, only if purchased during designated hours at state-run depots, and so forth. A younger man tears the notice off and reads it aloud, voice thick with sarcasm. For the convenience of the dear subjects. The crowd's reaction vacillates between cautious hope and outright eye roll. One farmer cracks a joke, at least it's something. I was half expecting them to give us a discount on the salt they confiscated from us in the first place. Laughter ripples through the circle, but it's laced with bitterness. You move away, the whispers of reform swirling in your mind. True, there's talk of adjustments to the Gabelle, but the monarchy's proposals come off as tepid. People have endured too many hardships, faced too many broken promises. Strolling past a row of crooked houses, you overhear someone speculating that if the monarchy offered real relief, like slashing the tax or allowing free trade of salt, perhaps it would bring calm. But the monarchy can't afford to lose so much revenue, not with empty coffers and so much debt looming. It's like watching a teetering seesaw. If the king grants concessions, the treasury suffers. If he doesn't, the people might revolt. By sunset, the villagers retreat to their homes, leaving the streets unusually quiet. A faint glow from windows reveals families inside, reflecting on the day's news. Is it time to relent and see if the monarchy's reforms take shape? Or should we press on with more resistance? The question lingers, heavy in the hush of twilight. At the edge of town, the fields stretch out in a gold and indigo haze. a reminder that daily work must go on regardless of what the crown decrees. Your eyelids feel the pull of rest, but your mind hums with all you've witnessed. The monarchy is trying to patch a cracked wall with a handful of mortar, hoping it'll hold. But you sense a deeper shift, like once people discover they can push back, half-baked reforms may not be enough to quell their anger. Still, for some, any hint of relief is better than none, and they cling to these whispers of reform the way a parched traveler clings to the hope of a far-off oasis. Night falls. The last rays of sun dip below the horizon, and you can almost hear the collective exhale of a nation poised between fear and hope. Tomorrow might bring more proclamations, fresh rumors, or renewed protests. Nobody knows for sure. But as you settle down, soothed by the cool evening breeze, you let yourself imagine what it would be like if the monarchy truly eased the burden. If salt once again became simply a humble seasoning, rather than a symbol of oppression. Such a future may be distant, but in these faint rumblings of change, you catch a glimmer of possibility. Morning light casts a gentle hue across the landscape, and you notice a subtle change in the air. The rumors of reform haven't vanished, but they've twisted into something more anxious. A collective sense that the monarchy itself can't decide what to do next. You move along a winding road toward a larger town, where stone buildings and bustling squares hint at a more central seat of authority. Entering these cobblestone streets, you pick up on the local chatter. Will the king finally commit to real change? One shopkeeper muses, scratching his head. Or is he just blowing hot air until the next round of taxes? Counters a skeptical farmer, hoisting a bundle of hay onto a cart. The monarchy's indecision has become everyone's favorite guessing game. Your steps lead you past an ornate administrative building, its facade displaying the royal coat of arms. Inside, you can imagine officials sorting through piles of petitions and proposals, a living testament to the kingdom's turmoil. Somebody jokes that if the king wavers any longer, they'll need to rename this office the House of Maybe. A few eavesdroppers stifle laughter, but you sense their exasperation. This is more than a simple debate over salt. It's about an entire system straining under the weight of its own contradictions. Following a narrow alley, you come upon a bustling courtyard where carriages arrive, bringing minor nobles, bureaucrats, and advisors summoned to weigh in on the salt question. The monarchy is apparently gathering input from all corners, whether to ease the Gabelle or stand firm and risk more unrest. You picture these dignitaries in powdered wigs, stepping gingerly over mud puddles as they hurry inside for closed-door meetings. You can almost hear the debate echoing through the corridors. Lower the tax. Absurd. The treasury is already strained, insists a finance minister. But have you seen the riots? Counters a provincial lord. If we do nothing, the whole kingdom might go up in flames. One mainstream historical fact underscores this tug of war by the late 1780s. King Louis XVI did indeed waffle between maintaining traditional taxes and considering reforms recommended by his ministers, like Jacques Necker or Charles Alexandre de Calonne. Yet every attempt to reduce taxes or reorganize finances clashed with powerful interests, nobles, high-ranking clergy, and courts that feared losing their privileges. Everyone wanted a solution, provided it didn't compromise their own slice of the pie. Wandering around the courtyard's perimeter, you overhear a cluster of minor officials gossiping. One lowers his voice, eyes darting left and right. I heard a rumor the king considered abolishing the Gabelle entirely. He says, the queen said it would look like weakness. Another official scoffs. Weakness. More like common sense, if you ask me. The group dissolves into hushed snickers, quickly stifled if anyone with real power strides by. It's as though the monarchy's hesitance has encouraged people to speak more freely. Careful, but emboldened by the sense that something has to give. You slip through a grand doorway, finding yourself in a cramped side hallway where the tapestry of daily governance unfolds. Officials ferry stacks of documents, sealed letters, and proposals back and forth. It's a swirl of tension, like a beehive on the brink of swarming. One comedic notion flutters by. Next, they'll be taxing sneezes. A junior clerk mutters as he balances a tray of quills and ink pots. Makes sense, says his companion. They've already taxed everything else that drips, runs, or sparkles. A few eyes roll, but the sarcasm underscores how thoroughly the monarchy has combed the land for revenue. Historians still argue whether this royal wavering was genuine indecision or a strategic stall tactic. Some interpret the monarchy's back and forth as an honest struggle to adapt a centuries-old system to modern demands, like trying to retrofit a horse-drawn carriage with an engine. Others suggest the king and his inner circle were mainly concerned with preserving their own power. They talk of reform to pacify the restless public, then do next to nothing in practice. As you pause by a tall window, you can't help but imagine courtiers in lavish salons, sipping hot chocolate while fretting over how to appease peasants they barely understand. Outside in the adjacent garden, you spot a walled enclosure where roses bloom despite the season's uneven weather. A few courtiers stroll the gravel paths, heads bowed in serious discussion. Snippets of conversation drift your way. If we concede on salt, one says, "What's next?" A call to end tithers, abolish feudal dues. The other man tugs at his embroidered cuff, replying, "Precisely. Our entire social order unravels if we give them an inch." You sense they're not heartless, they simply fear that changing too much will undermine the monarchy's centuries-long hold on power. The monarchy, in essence, stands at a crossroads: continue the old ways and risk revolt, or open the door to reforms and risk unraveling the entire tapestry of tradition. A quirky tidbit catches your ear from a passing footman. He whispers that the king's advisors once floated the idea of a salt rebranding, renaming the Gabelle, the royal seasoning fee, to make it sound less oppressive. According to rumor, the queen found the idea laughable. The footman says he overheard her remark, "You can dress a pig in silk, but it's still a pig." Whether that anecdote is true or pure court gossip, it illustrates the monarchy's desperation to handle the Gabelle's toxic reputation without actually letting go of the revenue. By late afternoon, you make your way into a side chamber where a group of local representatives, wealthy commoners not quite noble, vent their frustration. "We can't keep living in this limbo," says a stout merchant in a velvet coat. "Either give us meaningful reform or prepare for more chaos." Another representative nods, adjusting his spectacles. "And if the monarchy chooses tradition," he says in a somber tone, "they're ignoring the tide that's rising beneath their feet." His metaphor paints an image of a king perched on the beach, refusing to budge as waves crash closer, each swell carrying the discontent of thousands. A light knock on the door interrupts the conversation. An usher enters, announcing a last-minute session scheduled for the evening. Everyone appears wary, as though they've been in an endless series of emergency meetings for months. "We'll see what new promise they present this time," mumbles the velvet-coated merchant, rolling his eyes. "Or maybe they'll just call for more taxes to fund the reforms," quips a lady in a feathered hat, eliciting a ripple of sardonic laughter. Stepping outside again, you feel the cool touch of dusk. The clouds overhead gather in subtle shades of lavender and grey, hinting at a coming nightfall that might bring a chill wind. You watch a carriage pull up to the gates, likely another noble or advisor summoned to weigh in. You can almost imagine these arrivals blending into a swill of black and gold coats, each wearing a perplexed expression that says, "Preserve tradition or embrace reform." The monarchy is stuck in a precarious dance, uncertain whether to lead or follow a tune that's grown dissonant with time. As you leave the administrative quarter, lanterns begin to glow against the gathering darkness. You pass by a few small knots of onlookers, hoping to see some influential figure stride out with a grand announcement. But no one emerges with triumphant fanfare. Instead, a hush settles over the streets, broken only by the clop of horses and the distant murmur of restless voices. Tomorrow may bring yet another decree, or perhaps just more hesitance. The monarchy's wavering has turned into a spectacle all its own, slow motion show with an uncertain finale. Feeling the day's tension cling to your shoulders, you retire down a quieter lane, searching for a place to rest. Overhead, stars flicker into view, each pinprick of light like a silent witness to the kingdom's indecision. If you've learned anything, it's that salt is no longer just a commodity. It's a fault line splitting old tradition from new possibilities. And as you ease into the solace of evening, you wonder which side the monarchy will choose. If it can make a choice at all before time, and the people make it for them, you awaken to a commotion echoing in the early dawn, a low rumble of raised voices and hurried footsteps that seem to pulse through the cobblestone streets. Poking your head from a small inn's doorway, you spot townsfolk rushing in the same direction, anxiety etched across their faces. It's as though the tension you've felt brewing has condensed into a sudden bolt of lightning. You follow the crowd, your heartbeat quickening with each step. Something has snapped in the night, and there's a sense that these salt uprisings are no longer just scattered sparks. They've become a roaring fire. Turning a corner, you find yourself in a broad square filled with people. Some carry makeshift weapons, pitchforks, staffs, even a few hunting muskets. Others hold torches, though the morning light renders their flames pale and flickering. Their eyes burn fiercer than any torch, locked on a cluster of royal officials cowering near the steps of a government building. A stern-faced officer stands at the forefront of the officials, trying to project authority, but you notice the sheen of sweat on his forehead. He knows the crowd could descend at any moment. Shouts erupt. You hear accusations hurled like stones. How dare you enforce that cursed salt tax? Our children starve while you line the king's pockets. Some wave scraps of bread in the air, symbolically mocking the daily struggle for basic sustenance. The official attempts to read from a scroll, perhaps a new decree meant to quell the unrest, but the crowd drowns him out. Each word dissolves in a chorus of outrage that's too raw for fancy calligraphy to soothe. Then it happens. A lone figure breaks from the mob, charging at the officers with a wooden club. The defenders brace themselves, chaos erupting as more people surge forward. You jolt backward to avoid the crush, stumbling into a shop's doorway. In a matter of seconds, the square transforms into a frenetic swirl of bodies wrestling for control. A pitched scream pierces the morning air. The officer tries to restore order, yelling commands to a handful of guards, but they're overwhelmed by the sheer number of furious townsfolk. It's not a carefully organized rebellion, it's an explosion of pent-up rage. A flash of comedic absurdity sparkles amid the chaos. An older woman flings a large wooden salt shaker at a soldier's helmet, clunking him right between the eyes. You can't help a wince and a wry grin all at once, thinking that might go down in history as the silliest missile ever used in an uprising, assuming the soldier's bruised pride can handle the retelling. Trying to skirt the brawling clusters, you slip down an alley and emerge onto another street that leads out of town. You sense this tumult isn't confined to one place. Others sprint by, speaking breathlessly of similar clashes in nearby districts. A mainstream historical fact underscores how, in the late 1780s, direct confrontations over the salt tax reached their boiling point in numerous French provinces. Villagers who once only whispered jokes about the monarchy's greed have taken up arms, or at least farm tools, and demanded drastic change. Heading away from the heart of the violence, you spy lines of peasants marching together. Some brandishing handwritten signs, "No more Gabelle." The phrase is repeated like a mantra, echoing off stone walls. You notice tears of both anger and relief on a few faces. Anger at long-standing oppression, relief that they're finally doing something about it. The older generation in particular seems both resolute and startled by their own boldness. "I never thought I'd live to see such a thing," mutters a grey-haired farmer, gripping a scythe. Another joke bursts from a young man at his side. "If the monarchy sees these scythers, they'll think we've come to harvest the king's hairpiece." Despite the tension, a ripple of laughter runs through the group. Humor remains a lifeline, even in the darkest hours. Historians still argue whether these salt uprisings were the direct catalyst for the larger French Revolution, or merely part of a mosaic of grievances, from bread shortages to the privileges of the nobility. Some claim that anger over the Gabelle lit the fuse, while others point to Enlightenment ideals and political mismanagement as the bigger spark. Whichever viewpoint you favor, there's no denying what's unfolding before your eyes. Everyday people, fed up with paying exorbitant salt taxes, are rising up in collective fury, and the monarchy appears unprepared to deal with the scale of this rebellion. You follow the makeshift procession to a rural estate on the town's outskirts. Word has spread that the local tax collector has barricaded himself inside, hoping his thick wooden doors will shield him from the wrath of the crowd. People gather on the estate grounds, forming a semicircle of determined faces. An older peasant woman pushes to the front, cane tapping on the dirt. In a loud, clear voice, she demands the collector come out to face his community. Seconds pass. A hush falls. The crowd tenses. Then the door creaks open, revealing a trembling figure in rumpled clothes, obviously having thrown on whatever garments he could find in haste. As soon as he appears, the crowd roars its fury, shouting about confiscated salt, crippling fines, and the cruelty of forcing families to buy more salt than they can use. The collector tries to stammer out a defense, referencing strict orders from the crown, but the response is a hail of stones and clods of earth. Panicking, he ducks back inside, slamming the door shut. A tall farmer with a blacksmith's muscles steps forward, rolling his shoulders. He raises his hammer and smashes it against the door. The wood groans under the blow, cracks spreading like a spider's web. Once the door gives way, the crowd spills inside. You hold back, unsure you want to witness what might happen next. Suddenly, someone seizes the collector by his collar, dragging him out into the courtyard. Cries of "Justice!" fill the air. A sense of dread knots in your stomach. You worry this may go too far. Then a voice pierces the commotion. Let him explain himself. It belongs to a local priest who's stepped in, arms raised. The crowd hesitates, like a wave frozen at the crest. In the stunned pause, the collector collapses to his knees, babbling apologies, claiming he only enforced the monarchy's rules to keep his own job. That moment lays bare the messy truth. While peasants see him as the face of oppression, he's also a pawn in a system that demands unwavering loyalty and punishes those who fail to deliver revenue. A debate rages among the crowd. Some want to punish him severely. Others suggest driving him out of town, and a few even propose turning him over to the monarchy in exchange for relaxed salt quotas. Emotions flare, accusations fly. The entire courtyard buzzes with tension. And then the unexpected a donkey trots through the broken gate, apparently spooked by the noise, braying so loudly that everyone bursts into startled laughter. The bizarre intrusion breaks the mood's fever pitch for a precious moment. People laugh despite themselves, and in that fleeting space, cooler heads prevail. They decide to bind the collector's hands but spare him any brutal violence. For now, someone warns. From there, you watch as the crowd disperses, leaving a battered estate and a shaken official. These peasants have flexed their muscles, and once that taste of defiance sets in, it's hard to imagine going back. You trek behind them, noticing their triumphant posture, but also the haunted looks some carry. Violence, even when it's aimed at oppressive forces, can exact a heavy toll on the soul. They've set a precedent no longer content with quiet sabotage or half measures. They've confronted an agent of the Gabelle head-on. News travels fast. By the time you reach a nearby hamlet, you find townsfolk already buzzing with rumors of an entire region on the brink of open revolt. One traveler excitedly claims that peasants are banding together, forging a loose alliance to stand against the monarchy's tax enforcers. They plan to swarm salt warehouses across multiple districts, seizing and distributing the salt. Another counters with a more sober account. No, they're disorganized. Each village is acting on its own. It's pure chaos. Maybe it's both. Revolutions don't spring into existence fully formed. They bubble up from local anger, swirling into a national movement when the moment is right. By dusk, you look back on this day and realize you've witnessed a turning point. The Gabelle is no longer just a disliked policy. It's become a rallying cry for a populace that has discovered its collective power. Peasants, once timid and resigned, now believe they can change their destiny by force if necessary, and the monarchy, still wavering behind court walls, seems to have grossly underestimated how quickly frustration can escalate into action. Night settles over the countryside, the darkness unable to mask the palpable electricity in the air. You hear a distant chant, some group venting their rage at the foot of another official's door, or maybe celebrating a small victory. The tension is thick, but so is the sense of possibility. You drift to sleep beneath a moonlit sky, your mind spinning with images of wooden salt shakers flying through the air, a donkey braying, and a trembling collector on his knees. Change, it seems, has fully taken root, and whether by scythe, hammer, or donkey-induced break in the chaos, the uprisings are now undeniably ignited. Daybreak reveals a kingdom thrown into disarray. You make your way through dusty roads where people once huddled and whispered about taxes. Now they stride with a sense of purpose, some brandishing the very tools they used to storm storehouses and corner tax collectors. There's no single grand declaration of rebellion, yet everywhere you look, the old structures of enforcement are crumbling under the pressure. If salt was once a small irritant, it has burst open to become a full-blown crisis. You notice caravans of displaced tax officials leaving certain regions altogether. Their wagons rattle down main roads, windows shut against the jeers of peasants lining the route. At one stop, a peasant boy, couldn't be more than 10, runs alongside them, waving a grimy cloth. You catch a snippet of his playful taunt. Need some salt for the road. The officials glare, drawing the curtains tight. It's a bizarre role reversal, like the child is now the one in charge, while the once feared collectors shrink into the shadows. At a ramshackle coach station, you overhear the worn-out stationmaster complaining that no one wants to carry official paperwork anymore. Smugglers, bandits, and even local couriers avoid any cargo marked Gabelle for fear of an angry mob intercepting it. A messenger jokes to him, "I'd sooner deliver a barrel of live eels than touch a salt ledger." You imagine the chaos that must be unfolding in the palace as bureaucrats realize their entire enforcement mechanism is unraveling. One mainstream historical fact looms large by the eve of the French Revolution. Many of the salt tax's administrative offices were barely functioning, some abandoned altogether. Control from the top was slipping away, replaced by local committees or bands of peasants deciding their own fates. Curious about the monarchy's reaction, you approach a provincial capital where rumors say a royal envoy has arrived. You find the central square brimming with a tense crowd, no longer content to bow in deference. The envoy, a dignified figure in a powdered wig, stands atop a wooden platform, flanked by nervous guards. He attempts to read a proclamation, some last-ditch effort to reaffirm the Gabelle or offer compromises nobody believes. The crowd remains silent at first, letting him speak, but as soon as he mentions the necessity of preserving the kingdom's financial stability, a wave of furious shouts erupts. People chant, "Down with salt oppression!" Others brandish signs plastered with mocking caricatures of the king as a giant salt shaker. In a flicker of comedic relief, a local jester scurries forward, juggling 3 salt cellars while balancing on a barrel. The crowd roars, partly in delight at the spectacle, partly in scorn for the envoy's message. The poor man lowers the scroll, panic in his eyes. You sense that, not long ago, a royal proclamation would have silenced any protest. Now it's met with open derision and a sideshow mocking the entire system. The envoy attempts a stern glare, but he's overshadowed by a throng brandishing pitchforks and half-empty sacks of contraband salt. Historians still argue whether this moment, when the monarchy so visibly lost its grip on local governance, was the true tipping point that doomed the old regime. Some believe the monarchy might have salvaged its authority had it swiftly abolished the salt tax, capturing public support. Others insist that too many other issues, feudal dues, national debt, a restless bourgeoisie, were already boiling over. In any case, you witness firsthand that the Gabelle can no longer be enforced by mere threats and scrolls. Leaving the tense capital, you ride with a farmer who volunteered to give you a lift in his donkey cart. The donkey trudges along, seemingly unimpressed by the chaos rattling the kingdom. The farmer talks about how entire villages are now refusing to buy or even acknowledge official salt. They've opened up free salt markets, makeshift stalls where peasants trade contraband salt at fair prices, or sometimes for bartered goods. It's an underground economy in plain sight, no one bothering to hide anymore. If the monarchy wants to arrest us all, he says, they'll need a jail bigger than France. You flash a tired grin, picturing the absurdity of the king building a fortress just to stuff it full of salt rebels. The immediate ripple effects stretch beyond salt itself. Some local lordlings, desperate to avoid peasant wrath, have quietly dropped other annoying fees. They realize that if the monarchy's salt tax can be toppled by mass defiance, their own micro-taxes for mill usage or hunting permits might be next. A quirky tidbit emerges from the farmer's story. He claims a baron in a nearby province actually started offering free salt to his tenants, hoping it would keep them docile. It worked for about a week, until people realized if one baron could do it, why not all? The baron quickly found himself swarmed by peasants demanding broader concessions. Poor sod, the farmer remarks with a chuckle. He tried to buy goodwill with a grain of salt and got a revolution instead. Soon you come upon a once heavily guarded salt warehouse, now battered by recent uprisings. The doors hang off their hinges, splintered and graffiti scrawled. Stepping inside, you see empty crates and scattered crystals that crunch underfoot. Remnants of a once feared depot, now looted. A pair of ragged teenagers lounges against a broken crate, chatting excitedly about how people power toppled an institution that seemed unshakable just months ago. One jokes that if they wrote a school play about it, the final act would feature the king himself stumbling into the wreckage, searching for a grain of salt to season his dinner. You share a subdued laugh, marveling at how quickly the wind has shifted. The monarchy, from what you glean in overheard conversations, is sending out frantic directives that rarely reach their targets. Officials have fled or joined the rebels. Soldiers are scattered, some reluctant to open fire on their own communities. You recall a mainstream historical fact that in the months leading up to the French Revolution, local militias often took control of armories and supplies, sidelining royal troops. It dawns on you that the monarchy's grand architecture of power is turning to dust right before your eyes, with the salt tax fiasco serving as a prime example of that decay. Historians still debate the monarchy's true understanding of this moment. Did the king realize the full scale of the revolt, or were advisors shielding him, downplaying the uprisings to protect their own interests? It's possible the monarchy couldn't fathom that a commodity as mundane as salt would ignite such fury. After all, if palaces' royal ceremonies and military parades once commanded awe, how could salty crystals tear down centuries of reverence and obedience? By the time evening falls, you've trekked through enough battered tax outposts and heard enough triumphant peasant anecdotes to see that the Gabelle's downfall is nearly complete. Maybe there's a final gasp of administrative procedure somewhere, but as a functioning tax system, it's kaput. People now shrug off the monarchy's threats the way you might dismiss a tottering scarecrow in a field. Of course, not everyone welcomes the chaos. Some wealthier townspeople worry that if one pillar falls, others might collapse, sending the kingdom into anarchy. But for the peasants, and countless ordinary folk who've felt the pinch of the salt tax for years, this moment tastes sweeter than any spice. Walking under a sunset painted in dusky pinks and oranges, you see silhouettes of families gathering outside their homes, chatting about a future where salt is freely traded. For a moment, it all feels surreal, as though you're witnessing the birth of a new world carved out of the shards of an old one. The monarchy can still boast grand palaces and ancient titles, but no one is listening to its decrees the way they once did. Laughter and low, key celebrations echo from farmyards where contraband salt is poured into communal barrels, given away without fear. The whiff of victory, mixed with cooking stews, now adequately salted, drifts across the twilight air. Your legs tire, and you pause beneath a willow tree whose drooping branches sway in a mild evening breeze. In this temporary stillness, you reflect on the whirlwind events. The salt tax, so ordinary yet so pivotal, has been effectively shattered by collective action and a monarchy's hesitant inability to respond. It's no single heroic figure or orchestrated plan that accomplished this. Rather, the kingdom's people, worn down by a system that overreached, simply stopped complying. One spark led to another, until the fires of revolt consumed the Gabelle. With the night settling in, you feel a sense of awe, and perhaps a little apprehension. Knowing that toppling the salt tax isn't the end of France's troubles, but a beginning of deeper transformations. The monarchy, tottering on shaky foundations, might attempt a last, desperate move to regain control. But as you journey forth, you can't help noticing that behind every door, down every road, the whispers have changed from fear to defiance, and from defiance to triumph. The unstoppable unraveling has arrived. And for better or worse, the reign of the Gabelle stands as good as finished. You wake to the gentle hush of a nation left staggering in the aftermath of the Gabelle's collapse. As you step out onto a quiet street, the first thing you notice is the absence of tension in the air. No watchmen lurking for smugglers, no anxious villagers peeking around corners to see if tax officials are coming. It's as though someone lifted a heavy cloak from everyone's shoulders overnight. Yet traces of wariness linger, as if France itself needs to rub its eyes after a long, troubled sleep. You stroll past a shuttered salt depot, once a dreaded site of mandatory purchases, now abandoned. The doors hang loosely, and a stray cat naps on the windowsill. In a different time, guards would have shooed you away. But these days, nobody seems to care. You bend to look inside, dust floats in the stale air, particles glimmering in the early light. A memory of frantic lines and suspicious eyes lingers in this hollow place, reminding you that every oppressive system, no matter how entrenched, can eventually fall to collective will. Your next stop is a modest marketplace that's coming to life. Farmers set up their stalls of vegetables, baskets of eggs, and even sacks of salt they've sourced freely or traded openly. People haggle and banter with an almost giddy relief, though you still catch threads of uncertainty. What does the monarchy's downfall in this realm mean for everything else? One older merchant jokes that if they can dethrone the salt tax, next on the list is the dreaded missing sock tax, a jibe at the monarchy's endless thirst for revenue. You can't help but smirk, remembering how humor buoyed spirits even in the darkest chapters of the Gabelle saga. In hushed tones, some talk about the monarchy itself, how palace officials, once so proud, seem to have retreated behind gilded walls to reckon with a swirl of crises. Historians still argue whether scrapping the salt tax could have happened more peacefully had the monarchy taken action sooner. A mainstream historical fact, even Louis XVI, seeing the writing on the wall, toyed with abolishing the Gabelle before events spiraled, but the indecision of his advisors, tangled in fear of losing control, led to delay after delay. And so the monarchy waited, hoping to placate the populace with half-measures, until there was no longer room for waiting. Turning down a lane behind the market, you discover small groups of neighbors gathering outside a local administrative building. The door stands open, revealing inside a handful of new community leaders, merchants, teachers, even a baker, tentatively stepping into roles once dominated by royally appointed officials. They're sorting out local disputes, organizing grain distribution, and yes, figuring out how salt can be shared fairly without oppression. One quirky tidbit emerges in conversation. Some villagers want to erect a salt liberty pole, adorned with crystals of salt and humorous slogans symbolizing victory over the old regime. Whether that's a fleeting fancy or a genuine plan, you can't help but smile at the image of a statue dedicated to sodium chloride freedom. Leaning against the doorway is an older gentleman with a walking stick. Someone you faintly recognize from an earlier demonstration. He catches your eye and waves you over. In a low voice, he recalls how just weeks ago, neighbors huddled in fear at rumors of raids and arrests. "Now look at us," he says, sweeping his hand across the modest but lively scene. Salt is no longer a cause for trembling. You sense the relief in his tone, though his posture betrays a certain exhaustion. Collective action has carried them this far, but building a fairer system is a challenge of its own. Pausing for a bite to eat, you accept a warm loaf from a local baker. Freely salted, she proudly declares, with no hidden fees or fear of confiscation. The taste is ordinary yet thrilling, a small pleasure once overshadowed by oppression. Nearby, children giggle around a fountain, splashing water at each other while an old fiddler plays a jaunty tune. From the corner of your eye, you see a donkey plod past. Maybe it's the same donkey that stumbled into that courtyard confrontation, unknowingly changing the mob's mood with its braying. You can't help a quiet chuckle at how such a humble creature could shift the course of an uprising. Alongside the everyday hustle, you hear cautious talk of what might come next. If the monarchy lost the salt tax, what other reforms will fall? Wonders a seamstress. "We can't just toss out every law," a blacksmith replies. "But now we know we have a voice." They exchange uncertain smiles, aware that forging a new social contract won't happen overnight. At least the fear has lifted, and with it, a sense of possibility takes root. As you move farther from town, the dusty road meanders between harvested fields. You pass a cluster of farmers repairing a broken fence, cheerful but subdued. After all, life goes on, planting must be done, animals must be fed. Yet the difference is palpable, like waking up from a bad dream and realizing the sun has already risen. They speak of new local councils forming to discuss fair taxes, protection from famine, and how to ensure no single edict can crush them again. It's not pure utopia. Disagreements spark here and there, and some cling to old habits. But the spirit has changed, from resignation to collaboration. In the fading afternoon light, you crest a small hill overlooking the countryside. A mild breeze ruffles the grass, and you pause to admire the quiet sprawl below. No longer do you see smoke from burnt storehouses or hear frantic cries. In their place, a subdued hum of reconstruction resonates. People rebuilding trust, forging their own paths. You can still sense the monarchy's uncertain shadow in the distance, but its once mighty hold feels weakened by the simple act of everyday people standing together to say, "No more." Eventually, the sun slips toward the horizon, bathing the fields in a gentle glow. You find a soft patch of grass and rest, recalling the entire journey from whispered complaints to open rebellion, from fear to a fragile victory. Salt, the unassuming mineral that sparked so much turmoil, now sits on tables freely, an emblem of relief and cautionary memory. There's hope that the kingdom, tired but unbroken, might find a healthier balance than before. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you let the gentle hush of a changing world lull you into deeper calm. Now, let each breath slow and deepen. You've followed a long path through fields of trouble and moments of triumph, feeling each pocket of tension and every ripple of resolution. Drift along the quiet roads of this tired land, imagining the soft glow of lantern light reflecting in puddles along an old cobblestone street. Picture in the distance the vague outline of a shuttered salt depot, a silent monument to challenges overcome. In your mind's eye, pass slowly through the hush of late evening, where every creaking door and distant rustle seems reassuring rather than alarming. Imagine lanterns flickering in a gentle breeze, the flames dance as soothing as a lullaby. See the silhouettes of grateful villagers closing their shutters with relief, enjoying the simple pleasure of tomorrow's promise. Let the final notes of this story become as soft as a whisper. You are safe, gently distant from any echoes of strife, and capable of welcoming the calm that follows. Feel the spaces between heartbeats expand, letting tension slip away like leaves carried on a quiet stream. If you wish, picture a warm bed in a candlelit room, a plush quilt ready to enfold you while the walls cradle you in an embrace of security. Let the sense of a tranquil night, filled with the soft hum of life, resuming its normal flow, wrap around you like a protective blanket. And as you sink into this serene aftermath, know that every tale, no matter how fraught, eventually settles into a gentle equilibrium, allowing you to step into the peace that restfully awaits. Tonight, breathe deep, ease your eyes shut, and trust in the warmth of a calm horizon.